LoveLore Library. Chapter 1297. She felt as if she had just finished a marathon. Was he trying to show her how strong he was? Ning Xuema's mind was still in a mess. She closed her eyes and emptied her mind for a while. Then, she started to regulate her breathing. Time ticked by. When Ning Xuema opened her eyes again, it was already half an hour later. She had recovered a lot of her strength. She got off the bed and walked around a few times. Other than some parts of her body that were still sore and her legs were a little weak, she had no problem walking normally. She looked around the room again. Suddenly, her gaze froze. She wasn't in the main hall that had been transformed from the valley. She was in Shinjuli's bedroom on Tianyin Peak. He had actually carried her back to Tianyin Peak while she had been unconscious. The Almighty was indeed the Almighty. His efficiency was high. She looked around the hall again. Shinjuli hadn't returned. She was the only one in the hall. That's strange. Where did he go? Shouldn't he be by her side asking about her well-being at this time? Why was he nowhere to be seen? Could he have regretted it after raping her and scared her away? Given Shinjuli's personality, he shouldn't be so irresponsible. So where exactly did he go? Ning Xuema didn't want to make wild guesses. She simply dressed up and walked out, wanting to look for him. Unexpectedly, she didn't find Shinjuli. Instead, she found a newly built two-story building in a bamboo forest. The building was built in the Almighty's style. However, the crystal bells hanging from the four corners of the building were different from the Almighty's usual style. Ning Xuema's heart sank when she saw the building. This building was faintly opposite the side hall that she lived in. It happened to be on both sides of Shinjuli's main hall. The image of Shinjuli and Yunqi holding hands flashed across Ning Xuema's mind. Her hands and feet suddenly turned cold. Was this a place that he had built for Yunqi? Had Yunqi finally moved into the Tianyin Peak? With Shinjuli's character, he would never let outsiders stay. Back then, when Rongyu Tianlan came here to play, she would also go to the guest room set up by the sun-moon sect below to rest after dark. She would not stay on the Tianyin Peak. Yunqi was even more so. Every time she came, no matter how late she played chess with Shinjuli, Shinjuli would ask her to leave. But this time, could it be that they had already decided on their marriage? Then what was he? What was he in Shinjuli's eyes? Since he and Yunqi had already reached this stage, why was he forcing himself on her? Could it be that he wanted to imitate the Yellow Emperor and marry two concubines? Enjoy the blessings of multiple wives. She stood where she was, as if her feet were nailed to the ground. She felt as if she had fallen into an ice cave, and her body was cold. She raised her head and stared upstairs. The curtains were lowered, and a snow-white veil fluttered in the wind. One look and she could tell that this was a woman's residence. Ning Xuema clenched her fists. After thinking for a while, she shouted, "Is there anyone upstairs? Can you show yourself?" No matter what, she had to have a good chat with Yunqi and find out what was going on. She didn't want to make things difficult for herself by making assumptions. She wanted the truth. The building was quiet, and there was no movement. Ning Xuema called out twice more, but there was still no response. She steeled her heart and flew upstairs. "I'm coming in." After not getting any response, Ning Xuema simply pushed the door open and entered. Chapter 1298. As expected, there was no trace of Yunqi in the building. However, there were traces of her everywhere. The interior was elegantly decorated. Whether it was the dressing table or the white jade couch, they all had the faint aura of a fairy. There was a small ivory comb on the dressing table, a bronze mirror engraved with patterns on the back, a few strands of long hair in the corner of the dressing table, and a small crystal hairpin. this crystal hairpin belonged to Yunxi. Ning Xuema had seen Yunxi wear it before. The cloud pattern engraved on it was a pattern that didn't exist on this continent. The mattress in the bedroom was neat and tidy. There was even Yunxi's orchid-like fragrance in the room. Yunxi wasn't in the room. To be exact, she wasn't in the building at all. She had also gone out. Could she have gone to watch the sunset and count the stars with Shinjuli? Ning Xuema stood in place for a moment before flying out and starting to search the Tianyin Peak. No matter what, she had to find them and get an answer. An hour later, she was disappointed. She had already searched the entire Tianyin Peak, but she couldn't find any trace of Shinjuli and Yunxi. She steeled her heart and was about to leave the peak to search when she bumped into Yelu Jing'an. Yelu Jing'an was holding a box of food. When she saw Ning Xuema, she smiled. "Xuema, you're up. Are you hungry? Here are some of your favorite foods. Why don't you have some first?" As she spoke, she took out a few dishes and placed them on the small table next to her. The food was indeed sumptuous. There were 2 meat dishes and 2 vegetable dishes, all of which she usually liked. More importantly, they were all medicinal cuisines that could greatly restore one's strength. One of them even had the effect of reducing swelling and pain. If it had been any other time, Ning Xuema would have felt a little warm inside when she saw these dishes. However, she felt like she had been slapped in the face. The special soreness in her body made her feel humiliated. "Did the great master ask you to send these?" Ning Xuema asked after taking a breath. "Master instructed me to send them to you at this hour." Yelu Jing'an didn't hide anything and smiled. "Ning Xuema. What about him? Master only instructed us to do this. He didn't tell us his whereabouts. Did he sneak away again? Had he gone traveling with Yunxi again? Or was it because he had raped her on a whim and felt sorry for Yunxi, so he had coaxed her?" Ning Xuema could only feel the fire in her heart rising. What was this? Daring to do it but not daring to admit it. What did he take her for? She suppressed the anger in her heart. What else did he say? Yelu Jing'an glanced at her and could already see that her mood wasn't good. Moreover, the way she addressed her master was also a bit strange. She kept saying he, even omitting the word master. Master didn't say anything else. He only told me to tell you that you have to train hard and eat well these few days. Ning Xuema. These few days. Did that mean that he would be missing for a few more days? She suddenly felt like laughing. Nothing good ever happened whenever he went missing. Plus, he had gone missing with Yunxi, Yelu Jing, and chatted a bit more with her and then left. Ning Xuema slowly sat down at the table. Based on Yelu Jing'an's tone, he didn't know about her actual relationship with the Great Master. He had already rolled in the sheets with her and had no intention of explaining their relationship, let alone marrying her. Did he want her to follow him without knowing the reason? Disciple and lover. Or did he still want her to be a concubine? Chapter 1299. Fairy Yunxi as the main wife. Shinjuli, I'm telling you, don't even think about it. She looked at the dishes on the table and took a deep breath. With a wave of her sleeves, she smashed the plates and cups onto the ground, smashing them into pieces. Shinjuli, now that things have developed to this point, you have to give me an explanation. Don't even think about making me follow you around without knowing anything. You want to disappear for a few days, right? Fine, I'll wait for you to come back. I'll wait for you to give me an explanation. If you really have feelings for Yunxi, I won't agree even if you kneel and beg me to be your main wife, let alone a concubine. I'll completely cut off all ties with you. Ning Xuema didn't expect to wait for 8 days. During these 8 days, Shinjuli didn't come back even once. Of course, Yunxi didn't come back either. On the other hand, Yilu Jing's food was delivered on time. Twice a day, the food was different every time. How could Ning Xuemo have the appetite to eat? Moreover, she had already cultivated the immediate technique, so it didn't matter if she didn't eat. During these 8 days, her body had already returned to normal, and her movements were like a gust of wind. She cultivated as usual. Perhaps it was because of the injustice in her heart, but the demon in her body became more and more arrogant. Almost every time she closed her eyes, the little loli's voice would ring in her ears, making all kinds of noise and urging her negative emotions. For example, he must be regretting it. He loved you so much in his previous life, but once he didn't love you anymore, he could still be so cruel to you. Now that he has lost his memory, he must want to abandon you again. He and Yinshi must have gone to play hand in hand, right? After all, he has been very close to Yunshi since he lost his memory. Momo, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for him to marry you? Stop dreaming. Look at the entire Sun-Moon sect. Does it look like they're holding a wedding? He doesn't even plan to have a showdown with the Sun-Moon sect disciples. The little loli's every word was like an iron nail, hammering into Ning Xuemo's heart, making her frustrated and making her want to go berserk. She felt as if she was going crazy. Half of her wanted to destroy everything, and the other half was filled with negative emotions. The other half of him kept telling himself to be rational and not to go on a rampage like a madman. That way, she wouldn't be her, and she would be degrading herself. She was Ning Xuemo, the straightforward Ning Xuemo. She wanted to wait for an answer before deciding whether to stay or leave. At the very least, even if he had to leave in a carefree manner. He couldn't let anyone see him as a joke. She decided to wait for Shinjoli for another 2 days. If he didn't come back by then, she wouldn't wait any longer. She would leave on her own. He would never appear in front of him again. She loved him, she liked him, but she would not let her love be too humble. She also had her pride. So what if they had rolled in the sheets? She could still happily let go and wander the Jianghu happily, without being tied down by anyone or anything. Love was not everything in this world. Other than love, she actually had many things to do and many things to attract her attention. Love is a bastard. Once the old one is gone, maybe a new one will come. Time slowly passed by in the hourglass. Another 2 days passed. Ning Xuemo sat at the top of the white pagoda and looked at the distant sky. She watched as the twilight slowly faded and the sky turned white. Then, she watched as the red sun finally jumped out and revealed its red face. Chapter 1300. She lowered her eyes slightly and chuckled. It was time for her to completely let go. Did she want to hear him say regret with her own ears? She wanted to hear him say that it was just a whim that night and it didn't mean anything. Ning Xuemo, wake up. His refusal to see them had already represented his current attitude. Why do you want to stay here and embarrass yourself? She had already asked Yilu Jing 2 days ago and knew that he and Shinjoli were still in contact. This time, Shinjoli wasn't missing. He just didn't want people to know his whereabouts. Ning Xuemo had already told Yilu Jing 2 days ago that she would wait for Dizun for 2 more days. If Dizun didn't come back, she would truly let go. She believed that Yilu Jing would pass on her final warning. Since he still didn't come back, it meant that he had tacitly agreed to let go, right? She didn't think that the final result between them would be like this. The great god who had lost his memories was not the original great god. She lowered her eyes to look at the sea of clouds under her feet. She vaguely remembered the scene of him holding her and falling down with her 10 years ago. She remembered that she had truly fallen in love with him at that time. She didn't think that once she fell in love, it would bring about this kind of eternal damnation. Now she finally woke up from this dream. It was time for her to completely leave. She took a light breath and stood up. Just as she was about to jump back to the mountain peak, she froze when she saw the person who suddenly appeared. There was a person standing in front of her. He was wearing a wide robe with large sleeves and a silver mask on his face. Only a pair of ink-black eyes were revealed as he coldly looked at her. His temperament was like ice and snow, incomparably cold. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes met his for a moment and she suddenly smiled. Her smile was like a flower, brilliant like the sunset. Great God! She called out as if she was wronged and happy at the same time. She also seemed to be complaining, You still know to come back. Do you know how hard it was for me to wait for you? Her figure rose and she threw herself at the person in front of her. The man's eyes flashed and he opened his arms slightly, waiting for her to jump into his embrace. As expected, Ning Xuema did not disappoint him. Like a swallow returning to the forest, she threw herself into his arms. However, before that person could do anything else, his body suddenly shook. A moonlight-colored ame piercer pierced through his chest and came out from his back. You! That person's gaze changed, and he sent a palm strike towards Ning Xuema. However, he had obviously underestimated Ning Xuema's reflexes. She didn't continue to fight after she succeeded in her first move. Her figure retreated like flowing water and escaped from the envelopment of his palm power. Of course, while she was retreating, she didn't forget to pull out her ame piercer. The sharp ame piercer left a bloody hole in that person's chest. It was exactly the same spot where Ning Xuema was injured. Wuemo, I won't fall at the same place twice. Does it hurt to be stabbed by this sword? Ning Xuema stood on top of a big rock and coldly looked at the person in front of her. At that time, he had schemed against her like this. Now, she was giving him a taste of his own medicine. She wanted him to have a taste of his own medicine. She had never been a magnanimous lady. She was particular about people who respected her, and she would respect them tenfold. If someone bullied her, she would return the favor tenfold. She had wanted to take revenge for a long time, but she couldn't find the opportunity. It was rare for this bastard to send himself to her door, so why should she be polite? She had stabbed him in the heart, and it was exceptionally accurate. Wherever the ice balls went, even the air was frozen. The surrounding vegetation instantly withered and turned into ice needles. Under the guidance of the other ice balls, these ice needles also flew out continuously. They made a sharp whistling sound and attacked Ning Xuema. Ning Xuema's expression changed slightly. She recognized this move. She had seen Shinjuli use it when he brought her to the ice field. Wherever it went, not even a blade of grass would be left. It could cut off the vitality of all living things. She didn't expect Wu Mo's first move to be this move. If she was hit by one of his ice balls or ice needles, she would immediately turn into a lump of ice and then explode with a bang. She wouldn't even have a piece of flesh left. Chapter 1302. At such a critical moment, Ning Xuema did not dare to be careless. She raised her hand and released a circle of fire shield to protect herself. Those ice balls and ice needles hit her fire shield and made a harsh sound. Then, they turned into snow mist and dissipated. The vibration only made Ning Xuema's arms slightly numb, but it did not cause any real harm to her. Ning Xuema was secretly relieved. Although Wu Mo's kung fu was very similar to Di Zun's, the power was still much weaker. Furthermore, she was no longer the same Ning Xuema from 10 years ago who could be trampled upon by others. Currently, her martial arts had already reached Earth Realm level 8. The power she could display could reach Earth Realm level 9.5. In the Tianxi continent, it was already rare for her to meet an opponent. Therefore, she could fight against Wu Mo. The two of them fought again. All kinds of moves emerged one after another. Wu Mo's moves were very similar to Shinjuli's. Ning Xuema had seen almost all of his moves before. After fighting with him for dozens of moves, she had a basic understanding of his martial arts and was able to counter his moves. After the real fight, Ning Xuema found that Wu Mo's moves were more conventional. It was more like a pre-programmed robot. Although it was very powerful, it was not very flexible. Ning Xuema had always been witty in fighting. She relied on her outstanding reaction and improvisation. She could adjust the moves at any time to achieve the best effect. She knew that Wu Mo was very familiar with the Sun-Moon sex kung fu. So, she simply mixed in the kung fu that she had learned before. In Wu Mo's view, every move of hers was specious. However, it was very accurate. Whether it was the moves or the angle, they were very tricky. It was impossible for him to guard against them. It was obvious that Wu Mo really wanted to kill her. The two of them fought, causing sand and rocks to fly everywhere. Every time their weapons collided, it was like a series of thunder. The movement was very loud. After such a big fight and for such a long time, no one came from Tianyin Peak. No one was willing to come up and take a look. It was obvious that Wu Mo had set up a wizardry barrier around her before he attacked her, so that no sound could be heard. Wu Mo had already cultivated to heaven rank level 2. Since the birth of his memories, this was the first time he met such a troublesome opponent like Ning Xuema. He had always appeared as an emperor, and there were very few people in this world who dared to fight against an emperor. Therefore, he only occasionally made a move to establish his might. Often, his first move would be able to shock everyone to the spot, making them even more obedient than little chicks. There was almost no chance for him to make a move, and even less of a chance for him to truly fight with someone. Although he was much older than Ning Xuema, when it came to actual combat experience, he was still inexperienced compared to Ning Xuema. If it wasn't for the fact that his level was much higher than Ning Xuema's, perhaps he would have been defeated after exchanging a few blows. It was obvious that he had underestimated her this time. And the result of underestimating him was only one word: death. Ning Xuema, you want to kill me? Wu Mo said in the midst of the battle. Nonsense. Ning Xuema replied him straightforwardly. In the current situation, either he died or she died. She didn't have a second choice at all. If you kill me, you will definitely regret it. Wu Mo's voice was as calm as flowing water, but the words he said were full of weight. Ning Xuema pursed her lips and smiled. I never do things that I regret. However, her heart slightly sank. Wu Mo was the substitute of the great god. His relationship with the great god was not ordinary. Chapter 1303. Wu Mo was the substitute of the great god. His relationship with the great god was not ordinary. If she killed Wu Mo, Shinjiuli would be very angry. What's more, Shinjiuli was now indifferent to her. Even if they had sex once, it didn't mean anything. If Wu Mo died in her hands, how would Shinjiuli treat her? Ning Xuema couldn't think of an answer to this question. Since she couldn't think of an answer, she simply didn't think about it. She had to take care of the present first. Wu Mo wanted to kill her now. She could only try her best to fight back. In a fight between two masters, she couldn't go easy. If she went easy, she wouldn't be able to see the sun tomorrow. Well, for Shinjuli's sake, if she had the absolute advantage, she would seriously injure Wu Mo or simply abolish his martial arts. He wouldn't be able to do anything and she would just let him live. The two of them fought again. After about 2 hours, Ning Xuema finally understood Wu Mo's martial arts. She began to fight back vigorously, forcing Wu Mo to retreat step by step. In this fight that was almost evenly matched, both of them were injured. Ning Xuema's light pink skirt had several blood stains, like blooming peach blossoms. However, what made her more gratified was that Wu Mo's body was obviously more injured than hers. The white robe on his body was stained with blood, almost turning into a flowery robe. Moreover, his wounds were much deeper than the wounds on her body. It was obvious that Ning Xuema had the upper hand in this fight. This feeling of turning the tables was really good. Ning Xuema's sullen heart finally relaxed a lot. Her mood was also much better. Wu Mo, last time I almost lost my life because of your plot. This time you want to plot against me a second time. Do you really think my temper is easy to pinch? This time, if I don't beat you to a pulp, my surname is not Ning. Ning Xuema's Ame Piercer burst out a fireball and hit Wu Mo, causing him to retreat a few steps. You will regret it. Wu Mo said coldly. You've already said that 800 times. I'm tired of hearing it. Can't you find something new? Ning Xuema snorted disdainfully. After dodging his ruthless attack, she smiled brightly like a spring flower, and the moves she sent out became even fiercer. A new wound was added to Wu Mo's white robe. If she didn't teach him a bloody lesson, he wouldn't know why the flowers were so red. The fresh blood on his body made Ning Xuema excited for no reason. Her eyes were faintly red. One move after another, she almost didn't give Wu Mo a chance to breathe. You're a witch. Ning Xuema, I won't let you succeed this time. Wu Mo's voice was cold and ruthless. Although he was already at a disadvantage, he had no intention of retreating. Ning Xuema wanted to laugh. Conspiracy. She just wanted to fall in love and have a good time. How did it become a conspiracy? What a joke. Wait a minute, he said she was a witch. Could it be that he knew about her past life? He knew about Shui Emo. She simply asked, you know Shui Emo? Wu Mo snorted, of course. How much do you know? Everything. Ning Xuema, it seemed that this Wu Mo had been by Shinjuli's side for a long time. He even knew about the things that happened more than 3,000 years ago. However, she was no longer Shui Emo, but Ning Xuema. Even if the two of them had the same soul, she didn't need to pay for the things of her past life. Shui Emo, even if you change your name and body, you're still you. Chapter 1304. Shui Emo, even if you change your name and body, you're still you. An unscrupulous and ungrateful witch. Isn't it enough that you tricked him once? Do you want to trick him again? I won't let you succeed again. Wu Mo's calm eyes flashed with killing intent. As long as I'm here, I won't let you succeed again. What a dignified reason. Ning Xuema laughed and deliberately angered him. Won't succeed again. Do you think you can stop us? To tell you the truth, he and I have already achieved something good. So what if I set him up again? You can't do anything about it. Damn it, I'm going to anger you to death. You're really scheming. Ning Xuema, he's so good to you. We're like Zhou Yu beating Huang Gai. One is willing to hit and the other is willing to be hit. What can you do? Ning Xuema laughed complacently. Last time, you took his heart's blood. Why are you doing it this time? This time, it's to take his life. Ning Xuema continued to anger him. She always had the ability to anger people to death. At this moment, she was also angered by Wu Mo. In order to achieve the best effect of angering him, she spoke without thinking, it's a pity that you won't be able to see it this time. You can't stop him from loving me. You're angry, right? You can't do anything even if you're angry. You can't kill me, you can only watch as my scheme succeeds. She spoke carefreely. Looking at Wu Mo's increasingly heavy and unmethodical moves, she finally vented the anger in her heart. She felt that her anger was almost vented. The ame piercers flashed in the air and transformed into hundreds of them. With a flip of her palms, the hundreds of ame piercers shot towards Wu Mo like a horse's peak leaving its nest. This was a new move that she had recently cultivated. This move looked dangerous, but in reality, only the main piercers could really hurt people. The others were just illusions. Even if they really hit the body, they wouldn't cause any harm. However, they had a very frightening effect, making people unable to distinguish between reality and illusion. Ning Xuema was very calculative. When she made this move, she had already calculated all the directions that Wu Mo would dodge. If there were no accidents, her ame piercers would pierce his Chi-Hai acupoint and completely cripple his martial arts, but it wouldn't really take his life. Shinjioli, even though you have betrayed me by taking advantage of me, I still have to do you a favor. Seeing that you loved me so much before you lost your memory, I'll let you live. When she used this move, her body also floated up, her posture was graceful as if she was flying. She followed the real ame piercer and flew over. She thought that if the first move failed, she could give him another palm strike. This time, she was going to settle this once and for all, so that he would never be able to do anything to her again. Just as the real ame piercer was about to reach Wu Mo, the surrounding air suddenly distorted. Wu's eyes suddenly, he squatted down. Poof! A light sound was heard, and blood spurted out like rain. The ame piercers didn't pierce Wu Mo's Chi-Hai acupoint. Instead, it pierced through his glabella. At the same time, there was a pop in the surrounding air. A light sound was heard, as if a wizardry barrier was broken in an instant. A white figure appeared out of thin air. Stop. He waved his sleeves. Ning Xuema had only used half of her movement technique when she saw the white-clothed man appear. Her heart fiercely jumped. Unfortunately, before she could do anything else, she felt a strong gust of wind blowing towards her. Chapter 1305. Her body was involuntarily swept up by the hurricane and flew out. Pang! Her body directly smashed into a huge rock. Although her skill was superior, she was still made of flesh and blood. The hurricane's strength was too great and she almost fainted from the impact. She slid to the ground and saw stars, making her unable to see the person in front of her clearly. Although her eyes couldn't see clearly, her heart was very clear. Great God, he finally came. She waited bitterly for him for 10 days, waiting for him to give her an explanation. She didn't expect that she would receive such an explanation. As soon as he appeared, he sent out a thunderous palm and almost slapped her into a picture. The blood in her chest crazily rolled over and over. The smell of blood wanted to rush up to her throat several times, but she swallowed it back down. She tried her best to open her eyes. After the dizziness passed, she finally saw everything in front of her. Her heart suddenly sank. On the opposite side, Wu Mo fell to the ground with a sword between his eyebrows. The mask on his face finally broke, revealing his celestial face. His face was as pale as a crystal. Compared to the blood on his forehead, his whole body was as fragile as glass. Shinjioli held his pulse with one hand. Wu Mo. He poured his psychokinesis into his body, trying to save his life. Di-Zun, don't fall into her trap again. Wu Mo's pale lips slightly opened. His usually emotionless eyes flashed with relief. You still don't believe me. Now I can only return it to you. I'm dead, your memory will recover and you will understand how she betrayed you in the past. His body emitted a circle of white light. His whole body became transparent at a speed visible to the naked eye. Finally, it turned into countless rays of light that circled around Shinjuli a few times and went into his glabella. Ning Xuemo looked at all this with wide eyes. She was so shocked that she almost couldn't speak. Wu Mo's glabella was actually his weak point. But the sword she just shot out was obviously aimed at his chi high point. Who would have thought that Wu Mo would squat down at the crucial moment? This was simply sending himself to death. She looked on helplessly as Wu Mo disappeared from the ground and turned into a ray of light that went into Shinjuli's body. She didn't know how to react. What exactly was Wu Mo? How could such a strange situation occur after his death? Could he be a manifestation of Shinjuli's memories? Would Shinjuli's memory be restored only after he died? Which life's memory would he recover? Was it all? And with Shui Emo? In the midst of her extreme shock, a strong uneasiness arose within her, as if some great calamity were about to befall her. She sat there, blood trickling out from the corner of her mouth. She watched Shinjuli's body flicker with light, and his aura became colder and colder. The past flooded into his mind like a tide. The blood-stained little fox, the young lady seeking medical treatment, the charming seduction, the traveling hand in hand, the seemingly joking wedding ceremony, the wedding night, and the final stab of her sword, everything felt like it had happened yesterday, causing his face to turn pale. When he was in the bridal chamber with Ning Xuemo, he already had some incomplete memories of his previous life in his mind. However, because it was incomplete, he couldn't connect them together at the moment. But now, he remembered everything. He also finally understood Wu Mo's origin. He always thought that Wu Mo was his twin brother in his previous life, so he was willing to stay by his side as a shadow, as a substitute. Chapter 1306. Only now did she understand that Wu Mo was her inner demon obsession. That day, she had decisively stabbed his heart. If Long Chuan hadn't risked his life to save him, his body would have died in the chaos. If he wanted to come back to life, his primordial spirit would need to cultivate for another 1,000 years. In order to save him, Long Chuan had used all of his blood essence and burned the Qilan's soul to refine a Qilan pill that could bring the dead back to life. It replaced his heart and allowed him to live again. However, Long Chuan's soul had scattered because of this. Wu Mo was the inner demon that he had refined when he was in despair. He had sealed all of his memories on Wu Mo and then fell into a deep sleep. Because of this, he had the problem of falling into a deep sleep every 1,000 years. Once he fell into a deep sleep, he would forget everything that had happened in the past. No matter how many grievances he had, he could throw them away with his deep sleep. Now that Wu Mo was dead, the memories that were sealed in his body automatically returned to Shinjuli's body. Before Wu Mo died, he did something. The conversation between him and Ning Xuemo was also received by Shinjuli. Shinjuli's aura became colder and colder. Even the clouds in the sky seemed to feel his mood. They pressed down and layers of dark clouds densely covered the sky. The wind on the mountain top was as cold as a knife. The snowflakes swirled along with the cold wind. When the snowflakes hit people's bodies, they would feel a burning pain and a bone-chilling cold. It was the pressure of a god. Ning Xuemo was pressed down by him to the point she almost couldn't breathe. He was the one who started it. 10 years ago, he had plotted against me once and almost killed me. Now he wants to harm me a second time. He wanted to kill me. I was just defending myself. Besides, I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted to cripple his martial arts. Who would have thought that he would squat down and automatically send his weak point to my sword? Ning Xuemo suppressed the disappointment and anger in her heart and quickly explained the reason. Shinjuli had been closing his eyes. Now, he slowly opened them. His pair of icy blue eyes shot at Ning Xuemo. It was deeper and colder than the dark night. Ning Xuemo felt a chill in her heart under his gaze. She couldn't say anything else. Shui Emo, I didn't think that I would be defeated by you twice. However, do you think you can succeed this time? Shinjioli spoke word by word. His voice was as cold as ice, almost freezing Ning Xuemo's heart. He called her Shui Mo. Could it be that he had recovered his memories from his past life? You. Ning Xuemo was about to refute when Shinjioli flicked his sleeve. Ning Xuemo's acupoints were sealed. Not only could she not move, but she could not even speak. She stared at him in disbelief, and her lips turned pale. Shui Emo, you will pay the price for your actions. Shinjioli coldly threw out these words. With another flick of his sleeve, Ning Xuemo felt her vision darken, and her body weakly collapsed. Shinjioli looked at the unconscious Ning Xuemo, a complicated look flashing through his icy eyes. With a slight movement of his fingers, a strong wind carried Ning Xuemo away. Cold, so cold. In the darkness, Ning Xuemo only felt a bone-piercing chill seeping into her bones. It was so cold that she couldn't help but curl up into a ball. She slowly opened her eyes. It was as if she was in the Ice Age. Wherever her gaze landed, there was a piece of sparkling and translucent ice. The cold wind was bitterly cold, and the wind was so strong that it almost flipped her over. The wind was mixed with frozen snow, causing her face to hurt. Ning Xuemo was caught off guard and was cut several times on her body. Chapter 1307. Blood slowly flowed out and then turned into bright red ice. Ning Xuemo subconsciously wanted to use the fire psychokinesis in her body to warm herself up, but she found that her psychokinesis was circulating very slowly, as if it was sealed. This little bit of psychokinesis was only enough to warm her hands and feet. Previously, when she fought with Wu Mo, she suffered a lot of injuries. Shinjioli's thunder-like palm directly shook her to the point of vomiting blood. Now, her psychokinesis was sealed and she was thrown into this extremely cold place. It was summer and she was wearing a light pink gauze dress. Now, when the wind blew, it was bone-chilling. If she hadn't cultivated to Earth rank level 8, she was afraid that she would be frozen into an ice sculpture in less than a quarter of an hour. Even now, her limbs were frozen stiff and in pain. She couldn't sit here, otherwise, her limbs would be frozen to the point of being crippled. She had to get up and move around. Ning Xuemo clenched her teeth and stood up, but her legs suddenly became sore and numb. She fell to the ground and her elbow was scratched again. She sat on the ice and her heart was cold. Was Shinjioli planning to freeze her to death? Just because she killed Wu Mo, Shinjioli wanted her to be buried with him. Ning Xuemo's chest was filled with anger, but her heart was gradually becoming cold, as if she had fallen into an ice hell. She really didn't expect that after he raped her, he would give her such an answer. His palm made her vomit blood, and then he simply exiled her to such a broken place. Wu Mo was seeking his own death, but what did it have to do with her? Even if she really killed him, it was a reasonable revenge. 10 years ago, Wu Mo didn't leave her with a way to live at all. She placed her fingers on her chest. Although the wound there had already healed and did not leave any scars under her treatment, it was still a place where she had been injured before. The excessive cold had caused her to feel pain there first, and it was very painful. When her life was hanging by a thread and she was being chased by Wu Mo, where was Shinjioli? Where was he? When she was dealing with Shui Lan in the Demon Palace, where was he? Why should she be treated like this? And from the looks of it, his memories of Shui Mo had also recovered. But hadn't he already taken his revenge in his previous life? His vengeance was so ruthless that it wasn't inferior to Shui Mo's heart-piercing sword. After recovering Shui Mo's memories, she didn't want to bicker about it anymore, because she felt that the previous life was the previous life. In this life, she couldn't be tied down by the grudges of the previous life. She loved him wholeheartedly, and waited bitterly for him for 10 years. What about him? What right did he have to be so calculative? He belonged to Chow Chow. Only he was allowed to betray the world, but others were not allowed to betray him. Why? Why should she be treated like this? No, she had to get out. She wanted to ask him clearly. She didn't want to suffer from this vexation. Ning Xuema stood up shakily and walked a few steps forward, but she was bounced back. She was stunned for a moment and raised her hand. As expected, she touched the barrier. She did not give up and walked in all 4 directions, only to find that she would be bounced back. The wizardry barrier in this place was like a 4-sided wall, trapping her in the middle. There was no way for her to escape. Could this be the purgatory of ice? Shinjioli threw her into the purgatory of ice to fend for herself. Was it also to avenge Wumo? After all, Wumo's punishment was to be locked in the purgatory of ice for a year, and now Shinjioli wanted her to have a taste of this. Was it to seek justice for Wumo? Ha ha ha, justice. To hell with justice. Chapter 1308. If he was really fair, he wouldn't treat her like this. It turned out that the current her in his heart was far less important than a substitute. When he was forcing himself on her, she mistakenly thought that he had fallen in love with her again. She was so wrong. She suddenly felt something sweet in her throat and spat out a mouthful of blood. That blood quickly condensed into a block of ice, which looked especially sparkling and translucent under the sunlight. Ning Xuema stared blankly at that block of blood ice. Suddenly, she remembered Shinjioli's emotionless eyes and his cold tone. Shui-emo, you will pay the price for your actions. She suddenly laughed out loud. Ridiculous. Sheet Ning Xuema was really ridiculous. Pay the price for her actions. Ha ha ha. What the hell did she do that needed to pay such a big price? She loved him with all her might, crazily missed him, desperately suppressed her inner demons, and worked hard to cultivate. What about him? Forgetting her, hurting her, teaching her a lesson, seriously injuring her. Now, he was making her pay the price. Right now, she had indeed paid the price. She had suffered a crushing defeat, a true crushing defeat. Shui-emo, Shui-emo. She was Ning Xuema. Why did she have to shoulder Shui-emo's debt? Besides, in her previous life, although Shui-emo had given Shinjioli a stab, didn't Shinjioli also join forces with Shui-emo to kill her? They were already even. Now, why did he act as if she owed him? Countless chaotic thoughts rolled around in her mind, clamoring. Ning Xuema laughed out loud and spat out a mouthful of blood, which sprayed onto the ground. Tianyin Peak, main hall. Shinjioli was minding his own business, playing chess. However, the time he spent in a trance was obviously longer than the time he spent playing chess. He had already recovered the memories of his previous life. However, he had only recovered the memories of his first life. After that, his memories were still blank. Shui-emo had killed him in his previous life. In this life, she had approached him with ulterior motives. Every word she had said to Wu-mo during their confrontation had been heard by him. In this life, she wanted to take his life. You're still here as a spy. He, Shinjioli, had actually fallen for her in both lifetimes. In Shinjioli's mind, the smiling face that he loved and hated at the same time appeared in his mind. The calmness in his heart was finally broken, and many complicated emotions surged in his heart. His fingers clenched the chess piece so tightly that his fingertips turned white. After a while, he raised his hand and poured himself a cup of fragrant tea. He took a light sip and frowned slightly. The tea was hot, but he had forgotten to cool it down. The tip of his tongue was burning, and his heart was burning with annoyance. How would she react when he sealed her psychokinesis and threw her into the ice purgatory? Yelu Jing and said she hadn't eaten anything these past few days. Every day, other than being absent-minded, she was still absent-minded. When he heard about it, his heart clenched. Only then did he return. However, he didn't expect to see her arrogantly killing Wuemo the moment he returned. Who gave her the guts? Was she really relying on his feelings for her to do whatever she wanted in the Sun Moon sect? Bang! One of the chess pieces in Shinjioli's hand shattered, turning into powder and falling to the ground. He lowered his eyes and sat for a while. Light gathered in his hand, and a water ball slowly formed. With a flick of his sleeve, the water ball flew into the air and turned into a mirror. Shinjioli waved his hand, and the mirror gradually distorted into a whirlpool. After that, it became clear again. In the mirror was a silvery white world. Thus, he saw Ning Xuemo. Chapter 1309. A pink-clothed girl was sitting there quietly, hugging her knees. Her long black hair covered her pretty face, so he couldn't see her expression. There were specks of blood on the snow around her, which had all condensed into pieces of red ice crystals. The wounds on the girl's body were hideous and bloody, but she didn't care. Looking at the shocking bloodstains, Shinjioli held his breath, and his hands involuntarily clenched. The pink-clothed girl stood up shakily, her long hair parted like a curtain, revealing a pale little face. There were specks of blood on the corners of her mouth. She walked forward, but was bounced back by the enchantment. She seemed to be stunned for a moment. Unwilling to give up, she walked in all directions. Undoubtedly, she was bounced back and fell heavily to the ground. The pink-clothed girl sat on the ground for a while, and then suddenly laughed. Her laughter was full of despair and sarcasm, echoing in the empty purgatory of ice. Shinjioli's hands tightened, and the teacup in his hand made a groaning sound, but he turned a deaf ear and just looked at the picture in the water mirror. The pink-clothed girl suddenly spat out a big mouthful of blood while laughing, splashing on the ground. Her pink dress was gradually soaked in blood, but she didn't seem to feel it. She kept coughing up blood, but she was still laughing. Her lips were full of blood, and her clothes had been dyed red. She laughed and fell to the ground. The teacup in Shinjioli's hand shattered with a pang sound, and the broken pieces cut a wound on his hand. Blood kept rolling down, and the tea splashed all over him. He didn't have any reaction, and still looked at the picture in the water mirror stiffly. The pink-clothed girl's laughter finally stopped. She slowly curled up into a ball, motionless, as if she was frozen. Shinjioli waved his hand, and the water mirror suddenly scattered. He sat there quietly, the tea rolling down his robe, but he didn't have any reaction. He just sat there for a long time without moving, as if he had become a sculpture. The afterglow of the setting sun sprinkled on his body, giving him a layer of fiery golden light. His figure was tall and straight in the light, but it was full of loneliness and bleakness. After a long time, he finally got up, flicked his sleeves and left. Ning Xuemo lay prone in the ice for a long time. The bone-chilling wind blew from all directions. She was trapped here with nowhere to run. His body felt hot and cold at the same time. His head also felt dizzy and he was seeing double. If this continued, she would die here. The last bit of reason in her mind told her that she should be meditating and recuperating instead of letting herself freeze like this. However, she didn't want to move at all. She just wanted to sit there quietly. It was almost as if she was torturing herself. She exposed herself to the cold wind and let the temperature in her body drop by drop. Her vision became darker and darker, and the sun also split into two. She tried her best to open her eyes, but the darkness surged like a tide, and she finally fainted. Before she fainted, she mocked herself. Ning Xuemo, are you counting on Shinjioli to pity you? Her lips curled into a sarcastic smile as she closed her eyes. What greeted her was a long darkness. After being unconscious for a long time, Ning Xuemo finally woke up. She was still the only one in the vast ice field. The cold wind whistled and swirled around her, as if it wanted to take away everything that had heat. Ning Xuemo lay on the ice, silently looking at the cold moon in the sky. Chapter 13:10. Her clothes fluttered in the cold wind, and she could no longer feel any heat from her body. The cold air from the ice entered her body and her hands and feet were numb from the cold. But she just laid there motionless. The cold moon was covered in frost and the cold moonlight flowed over her body. The ice purgatory was even colder in the dark night, almost freezing people from the inside out. Under the moonlight, her face was as white as snow and the blood on her clothes had frozen into ice crystals. They were hard and emitted a hazy light under the moonlight. There was no trace of blood on her cherry blossom-like lips, and her eyes that were always as bright as stars were dark without a trace of light. It was as if even the most dazzling light was swallowed by the darkness and couldn't enter her eyes. She quietly laid there for the entire night. She had never thought that she would have a time like this. Lying alone on the ice field, watching the morning sun tear through the darkness and slowly rise through the cracks. A ray of sunlight fell on her body and onto her pale face. Her body was gradually covered in a layer of golden light. Her entire body was dazzling on the ice, like a shining angel. But in her eyes, there was a coldness that couldn't be compared to last night's cold moon. The sunlight became stronger and stronger, but Ning Xuemo couldn't feel a trace of warmth. The cold air had already entered her body like she was terminally ill. Now that the sunlight had arrived late, it didn't have the slightest effect. Ning Xuemo looked at the clouds in the sky for a long time before finally closing her eyes. Ever since she transmigrated, she had always strived to survive. No matter how difficult it was, she had never felt despair. But now her heart was filled with despair. Bang! Another teacup broke. Yellow Jing and didn't know how many times he had cleaned up the broken teacups these past few days. He looked at the ancestors' increasingly gloomy expression and an ominous feeling flashed through his heart. But there were some things he didn't dare to ask and couldn't ask. So after he respectfully cleaned up the broken teacups, he silently left. Shinjioli's expression became worse and colder. At the same time, the anger in his heart became stronger and stronger. When he sealed her spiritual force, he didn't use too much force. As long as she put in a bit of effort, she could break it open and meditate to resist the cold. But she didn't do anything and just laid there on the ice. What was she doing? Was he seeking death? Looking at her body buried in the snow, his heart couldn't help but clench into a ball. When Ning Xuemo woke up again, it was night again. However, this time, the night was completely dark. The cold moon from last night was nowhere to be seen. She had given up on herself for 2 days, and her body was almost stiff. Ning Xuemo's heart finally calmed down. There were no more waves in her heart. She only felt tired, extremely tired. It didn't seem like a bad idea to just rest here forever. For the past 2 days, she had been lying motionless on the ground. The snow had almost buried her, leaving only her pale and bloodless face exposed. Ning Xuemo made up her mind to sleep forever. Perhaps she would be able to go back to her own world when she really couldn't wake up. She would no longer care about this world. So after looking at the sky for a while, she fell asleep again. This time, she had a dream. In the dream, it was a distant past life. It was that unruly and unrestrained secret agent boss Ning Xuemo. Ning Xuemo stood quietly to the side. Looking at her majestic and confident past life, she suddenly felt a sense of absent-mindedness in her heart. It had only been 10 years, but Ning Xuemo felt that she had aged a lot. Chapter 13:11. Looking at herself at that time, she only felt that she was young and frivolous. How did she end up like this? Why did she become like this? Even Ning Xuemo was disgusted with herself. Perhaps everyone in the world had to face a tribulation. If they passed, they would live. If they didn't, they would die. Shinjiuli was the biggest tribulation in her life. If she could get through this, she wanted to fly far away. From then on, she would be far away from him, to the ends of the earth, and they would never cross paths again. If she couldn't pass it, she would be buried under the snow. From then on, she would have nothing to do with this world and would sleep forever. On the third day, Ning Xuemo finally sat up and meditated quietly. She thought that she must break through this ice purgatory and sever her relationship with Shinjiuli. Then, she would leave and never come back. The psychokinesis that had been stagnant for 3 days began to circulate and break through the frozen blood vessels. This process was like thousands of ants gnawing at her heart. It was very painful. Ning Xuemo bit her lower lip hard to prevent herself from making a sound. She was already pitiful enough. If she cried out, wouldn't she be even more pitiful? She, Ning Xuemo, did not need to be pitied. The more painful it was, the more she accelerated her psychokinesis to make herself feel more pain. Ning Xuemo fell into a masochistic pleasure. She was in so much pain that she almost fainted. However, she tried to stay awake. There was only one thought in her mind. Ning Xuemo, this is the price you have to pay for falling in love with Shinjiuli. The price you have to pay for falling in love with a god. The more painful it was, the more awake she was. Cold sweat broke out all over her body. Her clothes were soon soaked. When the cold wind blew, her clothes froze again. They stuck tightly to her skin and almost froze her whole body. She circulated her energy for a day and a night and finally unblocked all the frozen blood vessels. Her psychokinesis was active again. However, she was in too much pain. As soon as she stopped circulating her energy, all the pain came up. She was in so much pain that she rolled on the ground. Cold sweat kept flowing down. Her vision was blurry and dark. Her muscles were twitching unconsciously. Finally, she fainted from the pain. Shinjiuli looked at the unconscious pink-dressed girl in the mirror, and his hand slowly tightened. She had been unconscious for a day and a night. Even when she was unconscious, her muscles would often twitch unconsciously. Then, she would tighten into a ball, like a baby in its mother's womb, tightly protecting herself and isolating herself from the outside world. The pain of forcefully opening one's blood vessels was not something that an ordinary person could endure. However, not only did she endure it, she did not even make a sound. Even though she was rolling on the ground in pain, she didn't make a sound. The girl's body in the mirror suddenly emitted a golden light, which gradually grew stronger. Shinjiuli's expression changed, and he stood there stiffly. A moment later, his figure flashed, and like a bolt of white lightning, he suddenly rushed out. Ning Xuemo was woken up by the sharp pain. She felt like she was about to explode. Psychokinesis was running wildly in her body, constantly expanding and suppressing her blood vessels. Was he possessed by the devil? Ning Xuemo was in so much pain that her face was pale. She wanted to shout and roll on the ground, but it was as if she was fixed in place and could not move. She could only watch her inner world collapse bit by bit and fall apart. She had never experienced such intense pain. It was even worse than the time when Yi Qinghuan used the soul-beating whip to scatter her soul. Ning Xuemo did not know what was wrong with her. She watched as her skin cracked inch by inch. It was transparent and emitted a dazzling golden light from the cracks. It felt like a porcelain jar that was cracked all over. Chapter 13:12. She felt like she was a porcelain jar that was cracked all over. The countless cracks on her body shot out rays of golden light, and the golden light was gradually expanding. The psychokinesis ran amok in her body. Her blood vessels were broken into pieces by the psychokinesis, and her internal organs were also cracking. The psychokinesis ran amok in her body. Her heart and lungs were like a hornet's nest, and there were holes everywhere. The overwhelming pain made her want to faint, but she couldn't. She could only endure the heaven-defying pain. She tried to control the psychokinesis that was running amok in her body, but she could not control it at all. The moment she tried to control it, it ran amok even more. Cold sweat kept flowing down her body, and her clothes were soaked in an instant. It even melted the snow under her body. Ning Xuema felt that she was going to die this time, and her soul was going to scatter. Half of her body was already transparent. When the sun came out, would she turn into ashes? The golden light grew bigger and bigger, and Ning Xuema's entire body was covered by the golden light. The moment the sun came out, Ning Xuema's body suddenly exploded with a bang. Countless rays of golden light flew out, and she scattered into countless rays of light. The sun finally tore through the darkness and shone on the earth. The cold wind blew past, and the broken pieces of pink yarn fell down, as if there was a romantic cherry blossom rain. The cold wind whistled in the empty ice purgatory for tens of thousands of years, and the rays of light in the sky were blown away. Suddenly, a man in white appeared out of thin air. He looked at the rays of light in the sky, and his fingers trembled slightly. With a wave of his sleeve, the rays of light seemed to have received some kind of order, and flew towards a direction. The rays of light in the sky kept condensing in the air under a strong control. The rays of light seemed to be unwilling to be condensed, and kept trying to disperse, wanting to disappear from this world. The man in white's fingertips turned slightly white. She had no desire to live. His lips moved, and he did not dare to be slow. He kept drawing, and countless charms were drawn, forcing the rays of light to condense together inch by inch. Slowly, a young girl was formed in the golden light. She had snow-white skin, long black hair, and delicate eyebrows. Her eyes were slightly closed, and she was sleeping peacefully. The golden light gently enveloped the girl and placed her on the ground. Shinjioli looked at Ning Xuema, who was becoming more and more beautiful, with a complicated look in his eyes. He reached out his finger as if he wanted to caress her eyebrows, but he slowly put his hand down. He lowered his eyes and looked at her. After an unknown amount of time, he finally turned and left. The fifth day. When Ning Xuema woke up, she felt that the psychokinesis in her body had stabilized and was flowing vigorously. If her psychokinesis was compared to the vast Yangtze River in the past, it was now a vast ocean. She felt as if she had limitless telekinesis. She actually advanced at this time. Ning Xuema didn't know whether she should be happy or sad. She looked at her own graceful body and couldn't help but curl up into a ball. Looking at the countless pieces of pink gauze scattered around her, her eyes moved. With a slight clench of her hand, the pink gauze flew into the air and quickly assembled into her gauze dress. Ning Xuema put on the gauze dress and felt a lot more at ease. She stood up, and as she walked, countless rays of light scattered. Ning Xuema laughed mockingly. Was this the pretentious system that came with the 9th level? Chapter 13:13. However, no matter how beautiful she was trapped here and no one could appreciate her beauty. Ning Xuema silently recited a spell, and the flowing lights finally disappeared. She slowly walked to the side of the barrier. After thinking carefully, she drew a talisman in the air and slapped it on the barrier. The barrier only shook a little, but it didn't move. She tried several methods in succession, from sunrise to sunset, and from sunset to sunrise. She used all the methods she knew. The barrier was firmly erected there, imprisoning her freedom and her heart. Even though she was already at Earth rank level 9, she would still be trapped here until she died. The most frightening thing was that she had a lifespan of thousands of years. This meant that if Shinjioli was ruthless, she might be imprisoned here for thousands of years. She had tried every means to escape from Shuilan and return to his side. So, this was the result. Shuilan had put her under house arrest, and Shinjioli had simply locked her in an ice house to fend for herself. Perhaps when he thought of her again, she would already be a pile of bones here. Shinjioli, you're really ruthless. Shinjioli, I regret knowing you. How could you treat me like this? I waited bitterly for you for 10 years, and this is your reward. If she continued to be so quiet, was he planning to lock her up until the end of time? She suddenly slapped her palm on the barrier. Shinjioli, let me out. I'll let go and let you and Yunshi be together. Let me out. There was only the biting cold wind around her, and no one answered her. Shinjioli, let me go. From now on, we'll be far apart. I swear I'll never appear in front of you again. Let me go. She shouted again and again until her voice was hoarse. She slapped the barrier again and again, and the skin on her tender hands was broken and dripping with blood. Shinjioli sat at the top of the white pagoda on the Tianyin peak. The clouds in front of him spread out like a mirror, and Ning Xuemo's figure was reflected in the mirror. He looked at her shouting those words, and his fingers clenched again. The mountains are high and the rivers are far away, and we will never meet again. She had spent so much effort to come to his side, but she had to give up before she achieved her goal. Let him and Yunshi be together. There was nothing between him and Yunshi. At most, they were just good friends. Was there a need for her to help him? His gaze paused on her bleeding palm and he suddenly exhaled. With a wave of his sleeve, the cloud mirror disappeared and returned to the white clouds. He lowered his eyes and meditated again, but his heart was still uneasy. After venting for a while, Ning Xuemo finally gave up. The corners of his lips curled up in a mocking smile. Perhaps he already wished that he was dead. Naturally, he wouldn't let her go. Even now, she still couldn't give up on that ridiculous and foolish thought that he would be soft-hearted towards her. Ning Xuemo, he was no longer the great god who treated her so well. He was a high and mighty god. She was probably just a pet in his eyes. When he was happy, he would stroke her fur and tease her. When he was unhappy, he would simply throw her out to fend for herself. The various thoughts in her mind were too tangled, so she simply stopped thinking about them. When she was in danger, she had a great god to rely on. When this great god brought her the greatest calamity, who else could she rely on? She could only rely on herself. She finally sat down to cultivate. If she broke through a few more levels, perhaps she would be able to break this barrier. Chapter 13-14. Her psyche power began to circulate, and her body became warmer and warmer. There was a faint golden enchantment around her, which blocked a lot of wind and snow for her. On the 6th day, Ning Xuemo stood up and habitually tried to break the enchantment, but she still couldn't break it. She had been disappointed again and again. She had been disappointed so much that she didn't feel anything anymore. She was about to go back and continue practicing when she suddenly found that there was another person in front of her. It was still the same wide white robe that fluttered in the wind. His face was as handsome as a god's, and his icy blue eyes looked at her quietly. Seeing her turn around, a complicated look flashed through his calm eyes. The moment Ning Xuemo saw Shinjioli, her body stiffened, and she took a step back reflexively. Her emotions were in a mess now. Joy, anger, disappointment, grievance, and hatred all came together and almost buried her. On the first day, she was full of grief and anger. If Shinjuli had come at that time, she would have shouted at him and vented her anger on him. She would only feel grievance and resentment, but she wouldn't hate him. On the second day, she was in a self-inflicted coma. Although she tried to say that the more pain she felt, the more awake she would be. But in her heart, she secretly hoped that he would come in and see her. Now, after so many days of coldness and pain, she didn't want to say a word to him anymore. Shinjuli had thought of her countless reactions. She would throw herself into his arms, or kill him with a sword. But he didn't think that her first reaction would be to retreat when she saw him. Shinjuli's heart tightened, and there was a pain spreading in it. The two of them were silent for a long time. They weren't standing very far away, and they could touch each other in a few steps. But in reality, they were separated by thousands of miles. Ning Xuema's eyes were indifferent and emotionless. Finally, Ning Xuema broke the deadlock. She looked at Shinjuli calmly. "Are you here to let me go?" Shinjuli didn't say anything. His eyes were so cold that no warmth could be seen. Ning Xuema made up her mind and said, "Shinjuli, let me go. You and I will never cross paths again. I promise that I will never bother you again. In the future, we will have nothing to do with each other. Green mountains and clear waters, let's not meet again." Shinjuli remained silent, but the aura around him became even colder. His thin lips were pressed tighter and tighter. Ning Xuema was stunned. She raised her eyebrows and looked at him. "You don't really want to take me as your concubine again, do you? Why don't you marry Yunxi?" "It has nothing to do with Yunxi. I will not take you as my concubine." Shinjuli finally opened his mouth. Strange, he didn't release her, nor did he force her to become his concubine. Then what was his purpose in coming here this time? Ning Xuema's heart sank. She looked at him with a sharp gaze. "It's not this, and it's not that. You can't be here to kill me, right?" Shinjuli's body stiffened. He didn't say anything. Was he really here to kill her? He was surprised to see that she had survived inside, so he wanted to add fuel to the fire. Ning Xuema suddenly felt like laughing. There were countless people in this world who wanted her dead. She didn't expect that he was one of them. She, Ning Xuema, had loved him wholeheartedly. She thought that she had already given him everything she could. Now he said that it wasn't enough and that there was still her life. Ha ha ha. Since he wanted her life now, it didn't matter if she gave it to him. She had lived long enough. If she could die in his hands, she would give up completely. She wouldn't have to suffer like this anymore. She opened her arms in a defenseless posture. "Come on, avenge your Wumo. I won't fight back." Chapter 13-15. Even if she fought back, she wouldn't be able to defeat him, so why should she do such a useless thing? She just didn't know what method he would use to kill her. Right now, she had the psychokinesis of an Earth rank level 9. It could be said that she was at the same level as the 1,000-year-old fox spirit Sudaji. She wouldn't die so easily. Shinjuli took a step forward. His icy blue eyes were emotionless, like the coldest and most austere deep sea. With just a glance, she felt an endless chill. Ning Xuema watched him slowly approach, her heart uncontrollably aching. She still couldn't do it. She couldn't keep her heart as still as water as she watched the person she once loved kill her with his own hands. But so what if she couldn't do it? Resist? Too lazy. So tiring. Falling in love was so tiring. It had practically exhausted all of her heart's blood. She suddenly fixed her gaze on Shinjuli, her dark eyes unreadable. "Before I die, can I make one last request?" Shinjuli's footsteps paused. His hands clenched, and his tone had a trace of fluctuation. What? Ning Xuema closed her eyes, her voice without the slightest trace of emotion. If you want to kill me, then kill me thoroughly. It's best if my soul scatters. I don't want to reincarnate. Living was too tiring, reincarnating was also too tiring. If she accidentally fell in love with him after reincarnating, that would be even more tiring. Right now, she only wanted to fall into a long and unconscious sleep, never to wake up again. Shinjuli's body stiffened, and he paused there. After a long while, his hand slowly wrapped around her delicate neck. Shui Emo, if I kill you, will you be sad? How could she not be sad? He hadn't done anything yet, but she was already so distressed that she wanted to dig her heart out. If he did, Ning Xuema let out a low laugh. Shinjuli's actions had always been fast, accurate, and ruthless. She might not even have the time to feel pain before she completely lost consciousness. This was also good. Ning Xuema opened her eyes and looked at the handsome face in front of her. She smiled and stared into his icy blue eyes, pausing between each word, I'm not sad. Because I never loved you. No matter if it was the previous life or this life. Her heart was throbbing with pain, but she insisted on finishing her sentence as if she was torturing herself. Shinjuli's body suddenly stiffened, and the hand around her neck tightened. There seemed to be a touch of pain in his icy blue eyes. But Ning Xuema didn't care anymore. She closed her eyes again and said indifferently, do it. The force on her neck grew stronger and stronger. Ning Xuema felt her vision darken. She was losing oxygen bit by bit. Her pretty face was flushed red, but as she said, she didn't resist at all. The force on her neck suddenly disappeared, and a large amount of oxygen was sucked in. Ning Xuema choked and coughed. Shinjuli's icy eyes were hard to decipher. Seeing her raise her head to look at him, he sighed. With a flick of his sleeve, Ning Xuema's vision went black and she fell limply into his arms. Shui Emo, this seat really wants to strangle you to death like this. His voice rang softly by her ear. When Ning Xuema woke up, she found herself lying on a soft bed. Her neck still hurt a little. She wanted to raise her hand to rub it, but found that she had been fixed in place. Shinjuli's back was facing her. His tall and straight figure stood quietly in front of a huge cauldron. Gurgle, gurgle, there was a raging fire burning under the cauldron. The heart of the fire was a rich purple. It was the three true fire that could burn everything. Something was placed inside the cauldron. It was bubbling and at the same time, emitting a rich medicinal fragrance. It floated and wandered in the air. Chapter 13:16. The entire room was filled with smoke, but the strange thing was that the smoke was not choking. Instead, it made people feel refreshed and invigorated. This was the alchemy room. As if he had expected her to wake up, Shinjuli turned around and lightly said, "You're awake." The flickering flames gave him a layer of fiery golden light, but his eyes were as cold as the deepest sea and the darkest night. Ning Xuema looked at his ice-blue eyes and her heart filled with an ominous feeling. Why did he bring her into the alchemy room? Was he feeding her medicine? Impossible, he really did not hold back when he strangled her. He wanted to kill her right now, so why would he treat her? Ning Xuema looked at him with vigilance and did not say a word. Shinjuli walked over step by step and looked down at her. His eyes were filled with complex emotions. With a gentle wave of his sleeve, Ning Xuema's pink dress was torn apart again. Was he trying to force himself on her? He had already forced himself on her once, did he want to do it a second time? Ning Xuema's charming face turned black. She coldly said, "Shinjuli, don't make me look down on you. Her voice was still a bit rough. It was probably because he had used too much strength when he had strangled her that her vocal cords were a bit damaged. Shinjioli only looked at her and his eyes darkened. Ning Xuemo wished she could curl up into a ball. The feeling of running around naked was too strange. She angrily stared at Shinjioli. What do you want to do? Shinjioli stood there for a moment. In the end, he bent down and gently picked her up. His hands inevitably touched her skin and Ning Xuemo felt like she had been burned. She tried to pull back, but found that she could not move at all. A certain scene from a certain night uncontrollably replayed in her mind. Her charming face turned red and she was both embarrassed and angry. Let go of me. Shinjioli glanced at her with a complicated look in his eyes. In the end, he sighed and hugged her tightly. Ning Xuemo tried her best to ignore the two hands on her body. She closed her eyes and refused to look at him. Her voice was cold and calm. Shinjioli, if you don't intend to marry me, then don't touch me. Her voice finally had a hint of sharpness in it. After pausing for a moment, Ning Xuemo opened her eyes and continued, but that was in the past. Now, even if you want to marry me, it's impossible. So, scram. Shinjioli glanced at her and didn't say anything. He carried her and walked step by step towards the big cauldron. The flickering flames reflected on his face, softening the outline of his face. Ning Xuemo looked at the side of his face and then looked at the bronze cauldron in front of her. Suddenly, a frightening thought flashed through her mind. This thought made her hands and feet suddenly turn cold. She struggled desperately to open her acupoints. The big cauldron continued to grow in front of her. Ning Xuemo's heart also became heavier and heavier. It was a bronze cauldron that was as tall as two people. There were simple and beautiful dragon and phoenix carvings on top of it. There were also some strange Sanskrit characters, strange flowers, strange plants, and strange beasts. The spiritual energy in the cauldron was very rich. She could tell at a glance that it was not an ordinary item. Normally, if Ning Xuemo saw such a high-quality alchemy cauldron, she would definitely think of a way to collect it and refine pills. But at this time, the uneasiness in her heart was too strong. Her heart was hanging high, as if something bad was about to happen. But she was powerless to do anything. She tried her best to open her acupoints. Countless spiritual energy crazily attacked her acupoints. Finally, the acupoints loosened a little. Chapter 13:17. She was overjoyed and was about to rush forward when Shinjioli quietly looked at her. That look made Ning Xuemo feel as if someone had poured a bucket of cold water over her head on a cold winter day. It was as if even her hair was frozen. Shinjioli finally looked down. His eyes were cold. There is no need to struggle. It is useless. He then sealed her acupuncture points again. Shinjioli, what are you trying to do? Ning Xuemo's voice trembled. She didn't know if it was because she was angry or scared. Although she already had an answer to his strange actions, it was too cruel. Ning Xuemo didn't dare to believe it. Even if he didn't have any feelings for her now, she was still his disciple. If he wanted to kill her, he could just give her a quick death. He wouldn't use such a cruel method to treat her. He wouldn't treat her like that. He wouldn't. At this time, Shinjioli had already carried her to the front of the large cauldron. They were separated by a small distance, but Ning Xuemo could feel the heat wave blowing against her face. Her beautiful face slowly turned red. Her heart sank bit by bit, as if it was going to sink into the depths of hell. What was he trying to do? Shinjioli silently hugged her. His ice blue eyes quietly looked at her. Ning Xuemo felt her hair stand on end from his gaze. She then stared back at him, not to be outdone. Her pair of beautiful eyes were filled with anger. Ning Xuemo, do you want to know about Little Apple and Hong Ti? Shinjuli suddenly opened his mouth and asked an unrelated question. But it made Ning Xuemo's heart jump. Her eyes widened. Where are they? Damn, too many things have happened these days. She actually forgot about those two little guys. With their speed, they should have already arrived at Buddha Lotus Mountain, right? Hong Ti didn't know the way, but Little Apple was familiar with Buddha Lotus Mountain. He should have already run back, but why didn't he come to see her? Could it be an accident happened? No, Shinjuli hadn't seen Little Apple yet, and it should be his first time seeing Hong Ti. But now, he knew their names, and he even asked her. Did they fall into the hands of Shinjuli? What did you do to them? Shinjuli didn't say anything. Instead, he gently covered her eyes with his hand. A somewhat hoarse voice sounded by her ear, Shui Emo, if you can come back, this seat will tell you about them. Ning Xuemo's heart suddenly sank, and then her whole body was violently thrown upwards. Amidst the countless flames, she saw Shinjuli's cold expression and pale face. Then, the boiling hot medicinal liquid came from all directions and drowned her. She wanted to struggle, but she could not move at all. She could only watch herself sink into the medicinal soup bit by bit, sinking into the purgatory of burning oil bit by bit. In the end, it sank into the depths and could no longer be seen. Above the big cauldron, the medicinal soup rippled, forming layers of ripples. Ning Xuemo had heard of the 18 layers of hell in some myths and legends. One of them was to wade through a sea of fire and be plunged into a pot of oil. It was said that when a person committed evil to the extreme, after death, they would be plunged into a pot of oil and fried again, but they wouldn't die. They would just keep on enduring. She didn't know what sin she had committed, to actually taste this while she was still alive. The taste of being plunged into a pot of oil. The taste of not being able to live, not being able to die. Pain. A heart-piercing, fiery pain. Her skin was undamaged, but every inch of her flesh seemed to have been plunged into a pot of oil and fried. Chapter 13:18. It was so painful that she kept trembling. It was so painful that she wanted to scream, but when she opened her mouth, the bitter and hot medicine rushed into her mouth. Her mouth was burning with pain, and she couldn't say a word. The medicinal soup seeped into her body bit by bit, passing through her limbs and bones, through her pores, and through her veins. Wherever it went, it was scorching hot, and the convulsive pain was unbearable. Then, it gathered in her dantian. Ning Xuemo had never experienced such intense pain. She wanted to faint from the pain and never wake up again. However, the medicine seemed to have endless oxygen, and it seemed to have the effect of refreshing her mind. So, she was very sober, and she endured this torture with a clear mind. She had thought of countless ways to die, but she had never thought that she would be thrown into a cauldron and boiled to death by her sweetheart. Exploded to death. She knew that she was unlucky because she was a jinx, but this degree of bad luck, wasn't it too melodramatic? How could he do this? How could he be so cold-blooded? In order to avenge Wumo, in order to avenge her previous life, he boiled her alive. The hatred in Ning Xuemo's heart was overwhelming. She was full of grief, indignation, and despair. The pain was like maggots in the tarsal bone, and her hatred also rose. The little girl in her body finally woke up, and she screamed crazily. The little girl also suffered the pain that Ning Xuemo suffered, and the effect on her was twice as much as on Ning Xuemo. Suddenly, there were countless flames in the ultimate where she was hiding. There were golden talismans circulating in the flames, and the Sanskrit characters were shining in golden light. At first, it was a little flame, but then it developed into a prairie fire at lightning speed, approaching her. She quickly set up countless layers of enchantments. Separated by countless layers of enchantments, the little girl still felt a piercing pain. Her whole body was illuminated by the talismans, and she felt like she was going to melt directly. The flame with the golden talisman was getting closer and closer to her. The ruins of End was originally filled with demonic chi, but wherever the flame went, the demonic chi painfully pulled at its body in the fire and finally dissipated. The little loli was in so much pain that she wanted to roll on the ground, but she couldn't. She forced herself to stand there and frantically set up a barrier. However, the barrier collapsed layer by layer in the flames and slowly gathered around her. The closer the flames got, the more the little loli's pain increased. Her head was covered in cold sweat and her heart was filled with despair. She did not expect that Shinjioli really wanted to kill Ningxiuema. It couldn't help but scream, "Momo, save me. So painful. It hurts." His voice was filled with pain and despair. Ningxiuema was in so much pain that it could barely speak. Save it. She couldn't even protect herself now. How could she save it? She was in so much pain in the scalding medicinal liquid, but she couldn't move at all. Her eyes were filled with floating medicinal herbs. It was so dark that she couldn't see the end of it. The little loli watched as the flames broke through her barrier layer by layer like a hot knife through butter. The pain gradually intensified. She suddenly staggered and knelt on the ground, spitting out a mouthful of fresh blood. Her eyes flashed with a touch of despair, and her voice was filled with hatred. "Momo, I'm sorry. He really wants to kill you. He even used such a cruel method. Even the demons wouldn't use such a method." Ningxiuema was in so much pain that her head felt like it was going to explode. However, the little loli's words were incomparably clear in her mind, carrying with them an overwhelming amount of hatred. Ningxiuema's resentment unceasingly churned and clamored. Provoked by those words, it instantly surged and fiercely pounced on Ningxiuema. Chapter 13:19. She couldn't hold it in any longer and spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood was as black as ink. It melted in the water and disappeared. "Momo. Become a demon. Give me your body. I'll bring you out." More than half of the devil aura in the ultimate had disappeared. The little loli was very weak, but she still insisted on shouting for Ningxiuema to become a demon. Become a demon. A sentence flashed in Ningxiuema's mind. It was what the little loli had said when she was bewitched by her. "Momo, become a demon. If you become a demon, you will be emotionless and loveless. You will never be hurt again. You will kill those who hurt you. Emotionless and loveless." If she became a demon, she would never feel pain again. Ningxiuema's eyes turned red. There were patterns looming under her eyes. The psychokinesis in her body flowed crazily. A wisp of black air flowed through her limbs and bones. It hit the acupoints that were sealed. The acupoints began to loosen. Become a demon. If she could escape from this torture by becoming a demon, if she could smash this place and destroy it completely, she would rather become a demon. How do I become a demon? She finally extended an olive branch to the little loli. The little loli was overjoyed. She ignored the pain in her body and screamed, "You just have to say, 'I want to become a demon, I want to become a demon,' 3 times in your mind." It had waited for this opportunity for too long. As long as she said it 3 times, her soul would completely merge with it. It would swallow her and replace her. It could really return to the 3 realms. With the help of this rare good vessel, it could create a bloody storm. Ningxiuema closed her eyes. Finally, she uttered those words word by word in her mind. Following the little loli's instructions, she repeated them 3 times. The little loli was so excited that her whole body was trembling. She even forgot to set up a wizardry barrier to block the burning golden red flame. After a while, Ningxiuema was still floating in the big cauldron. The little loli was still in the ultimate, looking at the flame approaching inch by inch. Nothing had changed. Everything was still the same. Normally, as long as Ningxiuema said those words in her mind, the little loli would be able to break out of the ultimate that had been locking her up. She would directly enter Ningxiuema's consciousness and swallow her soul to replace her. But to his surprise, it was completely useless. It was as if a passageway had been forcibly closed. How could this be? Could it be that it needed to charge out of the ultimate by itself? But I never needed it before, or was it because Ningxiuema had a special physique that it needed to do it on its own? But the little loli looked around at the flames that were flashing with talismans. She was a little scared. The flames were still outside the barrier it had set up, but it was already in so much pain that it wanted to stomp its feet. If it were to rush out, it would definitely have to pass through the flames. It was afraid that it would be completely refined before it could rush out of the sinkhole. It anxiously paced back and forth within the barrier, unable to make a decision for a moment. Ningxiuema was also a little puzzled. Had she become a demon? Why did she feel that there was no difference? Her acupuncture points were still sealed. Her body was still soaked in the boiling medicinal soup and suffering. Damn it, even this demon could not be relied on at the crucial moment. The little loli naturally did not want to give up this rare opportunity. She struck out her palm from within the ultimate. Shinjioli stood stiffly beside the cauldron and looked at it motionlessly. After an unknown period of time, he turned around and looked at the burning sandalwood beside the table. His fingers tightened. Chapter 13:20. Time passed bit by bit, and the sandalwood slowly burned. A few wisps of black gas suddenly rose from the cauldron, and the surface of the cauldron began to ripple. The ripples intensified, and the surface of the water continued to bubble. It became more and more urgent, as if it was boiling, as if something was about to rush up. Demonic chi. Shinjioli's face sank. He raised his hand, and a flame was emitted. With a boom, the three tastes true fire became more vigorous. A mournful scream came from inside, and the flame in the ultimate suddenly flourished. The little loli's enchantment broke several layers in an instant, and the golden talisman became even more dazzling. Her body was twisted beyond recognition, and she broke out in a cold sweat. Finally, she could not help but scream, "Shinjioli, you will die a horrible death." Shinjioli. The little loli's voice had materialized, and it came out from Ningxiuema's abdomen. The voice was sharp and dull, and it resounded in the hole. Shinjioli's expression became colder. A blue light was emitted, and it drilled into the medicinal soup. Ningxiuema was originally dizzy, but she suddenly felt as if she had fallen into an ice cave. It was so cold that she was almost frozen. The wisp of ice followed her blood vessels and flowed through her limbs and bones. Wherever it passed, her blood vessels were almost frozen, and it finally flowed into her dantian. The red color that had just gathered in her eyes dissipated in an instant, and it turned into jet-black pupils. There was a clear pain in her eyes. What did he want to do? Was he going to kill her with the combination of cold and heat? The little loli in her dantian felt that her feet were slowly freezing. The fire was clearly in front of her, but she was so cold that she trembled. Her feet were already frozen, and she could not move. She could only watch as the enchantments broke one after another. The flame reflected on her pale face, and it clearly reflected her frightened expression. She shouted in Ningxiuema's mind, "Momo! Momo, beg him. Hurry up and beg him. If you don't beg, we will really die." Ningxiuema's face was as white as snow. She gritted her teeth, closed her eyes, and said resolutely, "Never. Even if I die, I won't beg him for anything. Ning Xuemo didn't say anything, so the little loli began to shout. Her voice was very similar to Ning Xuemo's voice. She kept screaming, "Master, I'm in pain. Master, I beg you to let me go." Shinjuli's body swayed as he looked at the boiling cauldron. Stealing his heart, he shot out another flame. Ning Xuemo let out a mournful scream. She suddenly began to cry, "Master, how could you do this to me, Master?" Her voice was very similar to Ning Xuemo's original voice. Shinjuli's body swayed slightly. He tried his best to stabilize his mind and set up an enchantment above the cauldron, blocking the sound coming from inside. His body was trembling slightly. He turned around and looked at the burning sandalwood beside the table. His heart tightened. There was still half left. The medicinal decoction in the medicinal cauldron kept churning, but there was no longer any black qi. But gradually, the medicinal decoction began to calm down. In the medicinal cauldron, Ning Xuemo's psychokinesis circulated wildly. Finally, she broke through Shinjuli's acupoints. The red light in her eyes was faintly discernible. She jumped up fiercely, trying to escape from this nightmarish cauldron. She hit the enchantment hard and was bounced back into the cauldron. The boiling medicinal decoction drowned her again. When Shinjuli saw the figure, his heart skipped a beat. The blood in his chest churned violently, but he managed to suppress it. "Xuemo, hold on. You must hold on." Chapter 13:21. Ning Xuemo kept jumping out, but she was bounced back into the medicinal decoction by the barrier. The barrier only shook slightly under her force, but it was still as solid as before. Finally, she fell heavily into the medicinal decoction, causing a splash, and then there was no more movement. Inside the cauldron, the boiling medicinal decoction actually calmed down. For a long time, there wasn't a single ripple. She fainted. Once she fainted, the psychokinesis in her body was very likely to go berserk, causing her whole body to explode. Shinjuli clenched his hands tightly. Looking at the medicinal cauldron that was no longer rippling, his face became even paler. "Shui Yimo, wake up for me." There was still no movement inside the cauldron. Shinjuli's face was pale. His hand touched the cauldron as if he was spasming, and he didn't feel anything even though he was scalded. "Shui Yimo, wake up. If you persist, this seat won't hold a grudge against you for trying to assassinate this seat, and you can even be this seat's disciple." The inside of the cauldron was as calm as a pool of stagnant water. Even though the three true fire burned fiercely, it couldn't make the medicinal decoction inside the cauldron bubble again. Shinjuli's figure swayed, and his indifferent expression finally cracked. With a trace of panic, he said in a trembling voice, "Ning Xuemo, if you persist, this seat will marry you. Haven't you always wanted to marry me?" Ning Xuemo already didn't know how many times she had fainted from the pain and then woken up. Shinjuli's words were still clear even though they were separated by layers of jade-green waves. He said, "Xuemo, I will marry you." Ning Xuemo only wanted to laugh crazily. She had waited for him to say these words for as long as 10 years. Day and night, she had hoped for him to say these words personally, and then become his bride, to accompany him hand in hand to the ends of the earth. Unexpectedly. She had finally waited for this vow, but it was in a situation where he was going to burn her to death. When he was going to personally throw her into the cauldron to refine her. The inside of the cauldron finally began to ripple again. Ning Xuemo's unreasonably hoarse voice came, "I don't care. Shinjuli, let me tell you, I don't care. I'd rather not know you in my life." She almost screamed these words out. Shinjuli's face turned pale. His mind became unstable, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. Shinjuli's heart felt like it was being squeezed by someone. Even breathing became difficult. Shinjuli's face was as pale as snow. Pain flashed through his eyes. She actually didn't care. Hadn't she always wanted to marry him? She actually wanted to never know him. Not allowed. He, Shinjuli, had fallen into the hands of the same person in both of his lifetimes. Therefore, he must hold this person in his hands. However, the ancient devil in her body had to be eliminated. As long as it remained in her body, it was in danger of completely devouring her soul. Therefore, Ning Xuemo absolutely could not become a demon. This demon-vanquishing soup was something he had painstakingly prepared over the past few days. It was all to get rid of the demonic qi in her body, to get rid of that demon. He knew that she was afraid of water, afraid of drowning, so he specially sent a steady stream of oxygen into the medicinal soup. He couldn't tell her any of this. He couldn't let the demon child realize that everything he did was to get rid of the demon. Otherwise, the demon child and Ning Xuemo's soul would coexist as a threat. Therefore, he could only let Ning Xuemo think that he was going to kill her and boil her alive. The process of getting rid of the demon was very cruel, and he had hesitated before. However, since she could kill him without hesitation in her previous life to save others, why should he hesitate for her? Besides, he was also trying to save her. In order to prevent her soul from being devoured by the demon child and truly perishing in this world. Chapter 13:22. In order to prevent her soul from being devoured by the devil child and truly perishing between heaven and earth. Therefore, he could only use this method. He believed that before he lost his memory, he also wanted to use this method. Otherwise, he wouldn't have prepared so many medicinal herbs in advance. He told himself that he couldn't regret it, but seeing her suffer in there, he was in so much pain that he almost suffocated. Once it started, it couldn't end. Xuemo, bear with it, another wave of pain that was worse than death. Ning Xuemo's vision began to blur again. Her limbs were numb from the pain, and she didn't feel like her own. At first, the pain was like a burn between flesh and blood. Later, it became an excruciating pain. Now, as she felt that her soul was being burned and melting bit by bit. In her hazy consciousness, she heard Shinjuli's voice. His voice was trembling slightly. Xuemo, bear with it. Ning Xuemo wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. Irony. What a fucking irony. Bear with it and boil it for a while longer. This was like extorting a confession by torture. When someone fainted, they would be splashed with a basin of cold water to wake them up. When they were awake, they would suffer endless torment. The heat seemed to flow into her heart. It was so hot that it was constantly contracting. It was so painful that she wanted to kill herself. She felt that she couldn't bear it anymore. She had no reason to bear it anymore. Let her die. Let her die a quick death. She really didn't want to live anymore. Living was too tiring, really too tiring. She was destined to be a lone star. She was destined to lead an army. Every step she took was a disaster. She was destined to be alone for a lifetime. Ha 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 ha. She finally caused the death of a group of friends. After causing the death of Shinjuli, who used to love her, she caused the death of herself in such a tragic way. Great, that's great. She should be thrown into the 18 levels of hell and into the boiling oil for a world-destroying demon like her. Ha ha ha. You've done a great job. The punishment was right. Now that she was in the frying pan, could she just go and meet her death neatly? Could she be given an ending where her soul was destroyed? She didn't want to reincarnate anymore. She wanted her soul to scatter into a million pieces and then turn into a wisp of light, never to wake up again. The heavens seemed to have heard the sincere prayers of this inauspicious person and decided to take care of her for once. Ning Xuemo gradually felt the pain fade away, and the sounds around her gradually disappeared. All the emotions in her heart were drawn away bit by bit, and her mind became blank. She felt that her body was getting lighter and lighter, and her consciousness was getting heavier and heavier. Finally, there was no more pain, only deep sleep. Within the Dantian's ruins of End. The fire was already tearing at the little Loli's clothes. The golden talisman was right in front of her eyes. She knelt on the ground, her face pale. She was sweating profusely as she struggled to support the last layer of the enchantment. Her entire body was engulfed in flames that were as tall as a person. The talisman stuck to the barrier and slowly melted it. The pure golden light shone on her body and burned small holes. She screamed again and again. The tongue of the fire slowly came in through the gaps of the enchantment and swallowed her body. The places that were burned by the fire instantly turned black. The wounds were so deep that her bones could be seen. The lower half of her body that was kneeling on the ground was almost melted by the fire. Her red dress was burning fiercely in the fire, the last layer of the enchantment was broken. In the little Loli's desperate eyes, the fire was overwhelming. She slowly closed her eyes. Was she going to start all over again? Starting all over again. Chapter 13:23. Suddenly, she seemed to have sensed something and opened her eyes. Momo had given up. She had fallen into a deep sleep. The little Loli's figure slowly faded. In the fire, she revealed a bloodthirsty smile and turned into countless streams of light, flying out of the ultimate. Shinjuli's face instantly turned pale. His divine sense could no longer sense Ning Xuemo's existence. Impossible, impossible. He had probed before. Her soul was very strong, and she was at Earth rank level 9. The inner demon was only around level 8, she could not have been dissolved before the inner demon. Shinjuli's body trembled uncontrollably. Then why? Why couldn't he sense her existence? Calm down. Calm down. Shinjuli forced himself to calm down and carefully probe the situation in the cauldron with his divine sense. The more he looked, the more his heart sank. It was as if his heart had gradually sunk into ice water. The Ning Xuemo in the cauldron was no longer Ning Xuemo. Although that person was extremely weak, her demonic aura was soaring, reflecting the bronze cauldron red. Where did Ning Xuemo go? Shinjuli did not give up and scanned her over and over again. Finally, he found a very faint white light on her body. The white light was somewhat weak, but there was a circle of enchantment protecting that white light. She was still there, but she had fallen into a deep sleep. Her body was controlled by the inner demon. Shinjuli did not know whether to be happy or sad. Looking at the increasingly intense red light in the cauldron, his eyes flashed with a touch of determination. No matter what, he, Shinjuli, must eradicate this demon today. This demon could not hold on for much longer. He raised his hand and a pure golden light was emitted, drilling into the cauldron. Ning Xuemo felt her body suddenly warm up. Something drilled into her blood vessels and then firmly protected a certain part of her body. It was like a golden shield, emitting a faint golden light. She probed with her divine sense. That was the place where Ning Xuemo's soul was sleeping. She tried to use her telekinesis, but it bounced back instantly, almost causing her telekinesis to collapse. Why did Shinjuli suddenly protect Ning Xuemo's soul? Didn't he want to kill her? An ominous feeling suddenly flashed through the little Loli's heart. Before she could react, heavenly lightning fell from the sky and heavily struck her body. Instantly, a ring of sparks burst out. Ah! Ning Xuemo screamed. She felt that half of her soul had melted in an instant, and her body had turned black from being struck by lightning. Ning Xuemo screamed, Shinjuli, you actually want to kill Momo. How can you be so heartless? Shinjioli didn't say anything. Another heavenly thunder struck down with the force of a thunderbolt. Ning Xuemo used the last of her telekinesis to set up a bounded domain to block most of the power, but there was still a fish that escaped the net. Her soul melted and only a small part of it was left. In the severe pain, she suddenly understood something. She used her divine sense to explore the location of the golden shield, and her heart suddenly sank. She was fooled. From the beginning, Shinjioli didn't want to deal with Ning Xuemo, but her. He wanted to completely destroy her. If she guessed correctly, the light golden thing should be used by Shinjioli to protect Ning Xuemo's soul. He sacrificed her body to protect her soul, and then completely destroyed himself. Ning Xuemo's face was pale. Once the third heavenly thunder struck, she would completely disappear from this world. Although Ning Xuemo's body would also be destroyed, her soul would still be there. Shinjioli would rebuild her body. Chapter 13:24. She was fooled. She was fooled. If she had known earlier, she would have formed a symbiotic soul with Ning Xuemo. That way, she could still threaten Shinjioli. But now, he was completely protecting Ning Xuemo's soul. She couldn't form a symbiotic soul with Ning Xuemo, that was his plan from the beginning. She was actually fooled. She thought that he really wanted to kill Ning Xuemo. He even planned to dissipate his own soul and wait for Ning Xuemo to reincarnate. This loss was really too big. But now, she had no other choice. She could only watch herself completely disappear from this world. Her vision turned black, and she felt that her body was melting inch by inch with an irreversible force. When the second bolt of divine lightning struck, Shinjioli's face was as pale as paper, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. He checked Ning Xuemo's soul and heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, under the protection of his soul, her soul wasn't harmed by the divine lightning. That faint golden light was actually a part of his own soul. He had separated it to protect the sleeping Ning Xuemo. The two bolts of divine lightning that struck down just now were all used on his soul. They didn't hurt Ning Xuemo. This was really a way to hurt the enemy by 1,000, but Shinjioli was determined to completely eliminate that demon today, so he didn't care about the cost of damaging his soul. His body trembled slightly, and he weakly held onto the bronze cauldron. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and summoned the third bolt of divine lightning. With this bolt, the demon would completely disappear. Momo. Shinjioli's heart sank. A red shadow suddenly flashed in midair, and at the same time, a red light carrying a vast demonic aura flew towards him. A white light flew out of Shinjioli's sleeve and collided with the red light in midair. The divine lightning struck at the same time. Three forces that were enough to destroy heaven and earth collided with each other, and an intense energy burst out. That red shadow was Shuailan. His face was pale from the shock, and he was knocked back a few steps by the shock wave. Kacha, a crisp sound rang out, as if something had broken. Shinjioli's heart sank. A wizardry barrier. The aftermath of the three forces had actually broken the barrier he had set up above the cauldron. Shuailan naturally wouldn't let go of this rare opportunity. He jumped into the boiling hot medicinal soup like lightning, endured the piercing pain, and carried Ning Xuemo up. He looked at the unconscious Ning Xuemo in his arms. Her face was as pale as snow, and her body was covered with wounds. It was almost impossible to see her original appearance. His hands trembled slightly. How could his Momo be injured to this extent? How could Shinjioli do such a cruel thing to her? A ball of white light flew towards him with the fury of thunder. Shinjioli said coldly, "Let her go." Shuailan couldn't dodge in time, so he could only resist. Although Shinjioli was seriously injured, he was still a god, and his power was far above his. The white light became stronger and stronger, and the red light was forced to retreat. After resisting this wave with great difficulty, he had already retreated 7 or 8 steps. At this time, Ning Xuemo in his arms suddenly moved. His body stiffened, and he lowered his head to ask, "Momo?" Shinjuli's heart trembled. He sensed that Ning Xuemo's soul under his soul was gradually waking up. She woke up. Shinjuli didn't know whether to be happy or sad. She woke up at this time. Could he still continue to strike her body? In this moment, the white light had weakened a lot. The red light took advantage of the situation to chase after it, and the two returned to a stalemate. Chapter 13:25. Ning Xuemo's soul slowly woke up and found that she was trapped in a pale golden cover. She could faintly smell Shinjuli's breath on it. Was this Shinjuli's new way of torturing her? Ning Xuemo's heart was suddenly filled with fear. She subconsciously hit the pale golden cover with all her might. However, the cover was impregnable and didn't budge at all. Would there be some kind of fire coming out of it to burn her in a while? Thinking of this, Ning Xuemo began to crazily hit the cover. However, it was the soul of a god after all. Her soul colliding with it was like hitting a stone with an egg. The more she couldn't get out, the more afraid she was. The more afraid she was, the more desperately she wanted to get out. Her soul faintly felt like it was going to dissipate. Shinjuli originally planned to lock up Ning Xuemo's soul, but later she hit it too hard. Her soul felt like it was going to dissipate. He could only withdraw his own soul and let her out. Ning Xuemo felt as if she had been knocked out of the light golden barrier. Just as she let out a sigh of relief, a powerful suction force suddenly appeared above her. She didn't have time to react before her whole body was sucked up. Everything in front of her eyes turned black and then light appeared again. Following that, she felt a familiar, bone-piercing pain. In Shuilan's arms, Ning Xuemo's eyelashes fluttered. He held his breath. Momo woke up at this time. Would she break free from his arms again? Shinjuli looked at Ning Xuemo, who was gradually waking up, and a complicated light flashed through his eyes. He then looked at Shuilan's attentive look on Ning Xuemo's face and then looked at the way he held her intimately. It was as if a huge stone was pressing down on his heart. The white light suddenly intensified, forcing the red light to retreat. Shinjuli's voice was cold, "Shuilan, let go of her." Ning Xuemo's eyelashes fluttered, and she finally opened her eyes. Shuilan could feel Ning Xuemo's gaze on him, but he couldn't spare a glance at her. He was almost defeated by Shinjuli's power. Ning Xuemo moved a little in his arms. He was so angry that he almost passed out. He said helplessly, "Momo, don't move." When Ning Xuemo first woke up, she was in a daze. It took her a long time to recognize that the person hugging her was Shuilan. Her body stiffened, and she subconsciously wanted to push him away. However, when she looked at Shinjuli, her hands paused. In the end, she put them down and allowed Shuilan to hug her. Shinjuli naturally saw her series of movements. He felt a burst of anger in his heart and said in a deep voice, "Ning Xuemo, come here." Past. What was he doing there? Be thrown into the pot to be boiled again. Ning Xuemo sneered but didn't say anything. Shinjuli saw that Ning Xuemo was obediently nestled in Shuilan's arms, ignoring his words. Could it be that her soul was damaged, so she didn't hear his words? So Shinjuli repeated it again. This time, his tone was a little stiff, "Ning Xuemo, come here." Was he so persistent in wanting to boil her to death? Did he hate her to this extent? Ning Xuemo suddenly wanted to laugh. Her once most intimate lover was now the person who wanted her to die the most. Today's sword points, in the past we were in the foam. The warmth and the hair, all for the floating pavilion. Ha! In fact, she didn't want to live anymore. She was finally free, but unexpectedly, she woke up again. Heaven was playing with her. Ning Xuema glanced at him. There was no emotion in her eyes. Her voice was so faint that it was almost inaudible. Shinjiuli, do you want to kill me again? Shinjiuli held his breath. Chapter 13:26. Shinjiuli's breath caught in his throat. The demon in her body hadn't completely dissipated yet. He needed to examine her properly to see if she needed it. Ning Xuema's indifferent voice continued, I'll do it for you. Before she finished speaking, she turned her hand and condensed a sharp dagger. She didn't even blink as she ruthlessly stabbed towards her own chest. Momo, don't. Xuema. Two voices rang out at the same time. The dagger in Ning Xuema's hand was knocked out of her hand by Shinjiuli's white light. Because of this distraction, Shui Lan's red light fiercely smashed into Shinjiuli's body. His body swayed and his face became even paler. Shinjiuli turned his hand and sent a white light towards Shui Lan again. Shui Lan was carrying a person after all, so it wasn't that convenient for him to fight back. In addition, his strength wasn't as good as Shinjiuli's, so he was once again forced back by the white light. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Suddenly, a green light flew into the air and revolved around Shui Lan. Although the green light was weak, it had a very strong healing effect. Shui Lan's boiling blood actually calmed down under the effect of the green light. Momo. She actually helped him heal his injuries. Shui Lan's eyes lit up and his spirit was greatly aroused. Shinjiuli's face turned pale. His eyes fell on Ning Xuema's body. Xuema. Ning Xuema closed her eyes. She waved her hand and a red dress appeared on her body. Blood flowed down like a small stream, but she didn't care at all. Her eyes turned to Shinjiuli and her voice was indifferent. Shinjiuli, whether it's the previous life or this life, I don't owe you anything. I know you're a god and we're not your match. If you insist on taking my life, then fine. I'll do it myself. If you're done with your revenge, let me go. Her face was as pale as snow, and her eyes were dark and gloomy. She looked at Shinjiuli indifferently and said, If you want to kill me, I will do it myself. If you have enough revenge, then let me go. With a flip of her hand, she condensed a dagger and pressed it against her own chest. She stabbed it bit by bit. Her eyebrows didn't even wrinkle. She even smiled and said in a mocking tone, Di Zun, you say the word. My life is yours to handle. You. She actually used an honorific to address him. Shinjiuli clenched his fists in his sleeves. His face was as calm as still water. Ning Xuema, I'm only doing this to get rid of the demon in your body. Come here. The expression in Ning Xuema's dark eyes was hard to decipher. To get rid of the demon in her body. She didn't believe his stupid excuse. He was merely taking revenge for that nuisance Wu Mo. He wanted to take revenge for the stab she gave him in his previous life. From the looks of it, he hasn't had enough yet, has he? He still wants to take my life, right? You don't have to do it. Xuema will do it herself. Ning Xuema's dagger pierced a few more times. Below it was her beating heart. Shinjiuli's breath stopped. I won't kill you. Come here. Let me see your wound. Her blood was still flowing. It stung his eyes. Shui Lan's heart sank. He was afraid that she would really go over. Momo, Ning Xuema didn't have the slightest intention to go forward. Instead, she retreated a few steps. She sneered and said word by word, Don't cry crocodile tears. Shinjuli, I won't believe a single word you say. Shinjuli's voice had a trace of anger. Ning Xuema. Do you think you can leave with him? Don't force your master to make a move. Master. Ning Xuema simply wanted to laugh out loud. What kind of master would cook his own disciple alive like him? Even if he had a deep hatred for his enemy, he might not be able to do such a vicious thing. Chapter 13:27. Shinjuli was speechless. Since ancient times, only the master would expel the disciple. Since when did the disciple swear to not want the master anymore? Ning Xuema, don't mess around. I will explain everything to you slowly, no need. Ning Xuema interrupted him. Shinjuli, either you kill me today, or you let me go. I will leave with Shuilan, leave with Shuilan. Shinjuli looked at her and said coldly, Ning Xuema, I always keep my word. If I say I won't kill you, then I won't kill you. But if you leave with Shuilan today, we will cut off all ties. Cut off all ties. He actually wanted to use this to threaten her. Shinjuli, aren't you overestimating yourself? Ning Xuema looked at him and revealed a mocking smile. She turned around and walked towards Shuilan. Her tone was so light that it almost disappeared with the wind. Shinjuli, you should have cut off all ties a long time ago. Shinjuli's face was pale, and his hands were trembling in his sleeves. He watched as Ning Xuema walked step by step towards Shuilan. His heart tightened inch by inch. It was as if she was walking out of his life and would never come back. He really wanted to rush up and take her back, but the words, should have cut off all ties a long time ago, nailed him to the ground. Maybe she really never loved him, whether it was in her previous life or this life. She was just using him, but in her previous life, she wanted his heart. In this life, she didn't do anything. Why did she leave? Blood was still dripping from her body. As she walked, the blood dripped onto the snow-white floor. It was bright and glaring. Shinjuli couldn't help but raise his hand. A white light covered her head. This was the light of healing. It could stop the pain and stop the bleeding. Shuilan's expression changed. He thought that Shuilan was going to pull Ning Xuema back again. He immediately raised his hand as well. The red light was released later but arrived first, directly meeting the white light. He thought that there would be an earth-shattering sound, but he didn't expect that the white light and red light would dissipate as soon as they touched. The red light didn't stop there and directly hit Shinjuli. Shinjuli's body swayed slightly before he steadied himself. He looked at Shuilan and curled his fingers slightly as if he wanted to do something. However, Ning Xuema's movement made his fingers freeze. Ning Xuema slowly raised her hand. A pair of shining ame piercings appeared in her palm. One of them was already broken, while the other was still intact. Shinjuli's eyes narrowed. This ame piercer gave him a vague sense of familiarity. Clang! With a crisp sound, the pair of ame piercings were thrown to the ground at Shinjuli's feet. Shinjuli, this is what you gave me before. Now, I'm returning it to you. I don't owe you anything anymore. Shinjuli was speechless. The pair of ame piercings had already gained intelligence. One of them was broken by Shuilan and lost its intelligence. The other one, however, was in perfect condition. Its spirituality was still there. Suddenly being abandoned, it seemed unwilling. It jumped up from the ground and flew in front of Ning Xuema, as if it wanted to return to her body. Shuilan flicked his sleeve. The ame piercer fell to the ground again as if it was blocked by a strong wind. There was another clang. The ame piercer felt wronged. It half raised its body and looked at Ning Xuema, as if it didn't believe that Ning Xuema had really abandoned it. Ning Xuema directly threw herself into Shuilan's arms and closed her eyes. Shuilan, take me away. Chapter 1328. No matter if it was her body or soul, they were both seriously injured. She had also reached her limit and couldn't hold on any longer. That pair of ame piercers had always been her favorite. When one of them broke, her heart ached so much that it almost bled. She had originally planned to trick Shinjioli into going to the Immortal Kingdom to find the blacksmith to fix it, but now there was no need. She didn't want it anymore. No matter if it was good or bad, she didn't want it anymore. Everything she was wearing right now was condensed from her spirit power. She didn't have a single thing that belonged to Shinjioli. If she wanted to break it off, then she would break it off completely and cleanly. Shuilan hugged her as if he was hugging a lost treasure. His voice was slightly choked. Momo, let's go home. His Momo was finally willing to leave with him. This time it was automatic. Ningxuema closed her eyes and didn't say anything else. Shuilan looked at Shinjioli one last time. Shinjioli looked like he was nailed to the ground. He didn't have any intention of moving. Shuilan's lips hooked into a mysterious smile. He hugged Ningxuema and turned into a streak of red light as he left. Ningxuema's final words echoed in the air. Shinjioli, if you let me go this time, the next time we meet, we'll be enemies. Shinjioli's face was snow white as he stood there. If he insisted on stopping them, these two people wouldn't be able to escape. However, at this moment, he couldn't reach out his hand. They should have broken it off long ago. Should they have broken it off long ago? The next time they met, they would be enemies. Enemies. He had never thought that there would be a day when they would be enemies. Even when she was Shui-Emo in his previous life, he hadn't thought of it. The ame piercers on the ground probably understood that they had been abandoned by their owner. They didn't move and the light on their bodies dimmed quite a bit. Shinjioli raised his sleeve and sucked them into his hand. The broken one naturally didn't react. The good one also had a lifeless aura. They still carried the scent of their original owners, which was faint and fragrant. He closed his eyes and sensed their bodies. Intermittent, sporadic scenes seemed to flash before his eyes. Great God, I really know how to ride a sword. Ha ha ha. Very good, give me a ride. Ah. Guru, you're so heavy, you should go on a diet. Shinjioli felt suffocated. His heart seemed to be slowly clenched by something. He understood that this should be the scene of him and her before he lost his memories. It was actually so warm and funny. So he also had such a mischievous time. So the two of them used to be so harmonious. Countless emotions whizzed in and whizzed out. He stood there for a long time, as if he had become a fossilized statue. Fire. There was fire everywhere. Ningxuema felt as if she was about to melt under the golden light of the fire. She felt a burning pain all over her body, as if she had been thrown back into the cauldron. She ran as fast as she could, but she couldn't get out of the fire's range. Ningxuema could only watch as she was slowly surrounded by the fire. Tongues of fire licked her clothes and devoured her flesh. Ningxuema woke up from her deep sleep again. She was sweating profusely. Everywhere was red. Red walls, red decorations. It was very similar to the fire in her dream. Ningxuema's body stiffened. Her mind was still a bit hazy. She struggled to escape, but once she moved, she pulled on the wounds on her body. She was in so much pain that her face turned pale. The pain made her suddenly wake up. She finally realized that this was the Demon Palace, her residence in her previous life. There was no fire. Chapter 1329. Her body was still in unbearable pain. She had already treated it, but her skin still felt like it was cooked. Just a slight touch would cause her to feel unbearable pain. It caused her to not be able to sleep well. It was as if there was a fire burning in her heart all the time, causing her to be impatient. She had never suffered so much before. And this sin was brought by the person she thought she loved the most. Injustice, anger, despair. Countless negative emotions gathered in her chest and condensed into monstrous hatred. It made her heart feel as if there was a fire burning in her heart all the time, causing her to be impatient. She wanted to disregard everything and kill him again. She also wanted to pull him into the sea of fire and perish together. But she was temporarily unable to do all these, unable to do it. The only thing she could do was to cut him in half with a knife. Never come into contact with him again. As long as she opened her eyes, her chest would be boiling with countless negative emotions, making her want to explode. Could it be that these were the emotions after becoming a devil? That day in the cauldron, she finally chanted the incantation to attract the devil, but she did not feel that she had immediately become powerful. After that, she did not talk to the little loli again, so she was not sure whether she had become a devil or not. She had tried to look for the little loli in her dantian, but her dantian was silent and dark, and she could not find anything. Originally, when she had negative emotions in her heart, the little loli's voice would desperately tempt her. Now that her negative emotions were about to explode, she did not hear the little loli's voice again. Had he already entered the demonic path? So the little loli's goal was achieved and she did not disturb her anymore. At that time, the little loli almost had the opportunity to promote the benefits of becoming a devil, saying that there was no love, no hatred, no resentment, no sadness, no joy. It was even more than the 4 elements that the monks preached. It was as if the 8 elements were all empty. But now she did not have any of those benefits. She could not think of anything right now. Once she thought of something, her head would explode with pain. To say that there were no benefits was not entirely true. That time when she was searching for the little loli in her dantian, a strand of psychokinesis touched something inside and she actually heard a slight squeaking sound. Then, a strand of extremely strong psychokinesis came from that thing and directly entered her limbs and bones. That time, when she finished investigating and opened her eyes, she found that her power had increased by a large margin. She had just broken through to Earth rank level 9, but now she was more than halfway there. She had the intention of breaking through to Heaven rank level 1, but so what if he broke through? She was still no match for that person. He still couldn't throw that person into the pot for revenge. This feeling was like a commoner fighting against a billionaire. There was no hope of winning at all, then what was the point of leveling up? At her current level, although her lifespan was longer, she would still die one day. Once they reached the Heaven rank, they wouldn't age or die. Am I a devil now? If he went out again, wouldn't he be hunted down by all sorts of righteous forces? And now, the Sun Moon sect was the largest organization in the righteous Tao. If they wanted to kill her, Helian Shao, Yelu Jinghan, and the smiling faces of her fellow disciples who had celebrated her return that day flashed through her mind. These people were all her friends, and they had never done anything wrong to her. Some of them were even her closest friends. Perhaps when they met again in the martial arts world, she would become their enemy. Looking at the things around her, she suddenly felt a sense of boredom. Chapter 1330. She suddenly felt a sense of weariness in her heart. Looking at the things around her, she felt even more frustrated. She closed her eyes and forcefully suppressed this feeling of weariness. She suppressed all the images that were involuntarily churning in her mind. Every time she moved her body, it hurt terribly. The most painful thing was not her body, but her soul. Her soul had suffered a great deal of damage, and she could only rely on sleeping to recover bit by bit. Every time Shuailan came to see her, he would see her sleeping soundly. But even in her sleep, her brows would often furrow, and there would be cold sweat on her face, as though she was enduring some kind of pain. When he applied medicine for her, he tried his best to be gentle. But her injuries were too deep, and there were too many wounds. Every time Shui Lan applied medicine for her, she would furrow her brows tightly in her sleep, and there would be a look of pain on her face. Ning Xuema's few moments of consciousness were no different from when she was asleep. She would just lie quietly on the bed, staring blankly at something. When Shui Lan spoke to her, she would not respond. It was as though she was living in her own world. Ning Xuema spent a month of this sleepy life, and her injuries were finally much better. Only her mental state did not improve much. Shui Lan came to talk to her every day, especially with some interesting things to make her laugh, but she did not respond at all. Finally, there was one time when he forcefully turned her face, forcing her to look at him. "Momo, look at me. Talk to me." Ning Xuema was indeed very cooperative. She looked at him motionlessly, and there was no light in her eyes. She was like a wooden doll that had lost its soul. Shui Lan was creeped out by her stare, and finally, he surrendered. Another month passed, and Ning Xuema's injuries gradually healed. However, her mental state was still very weak. Although she was awake, it seemed like she would fall asleep at any moment. The godly doctor that Shui Lan had captured said in a trembling voice, "Perhaps, you should bring this lady out for a walk." Shui Lan tightened his grip on the teacup, causing it to shatter. What if they bumped into Shinjuli again? He looked at him coldly. "If you can't think of another way, you can go die." The godly doctor was so worried that his hair had turned white. He was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheeks. In the end, he said helplessly, "This lady is suffering from a mental illness and needs time to recuperate. Let her walk around the garden and look at the flowers and clouds. Maybe she will feel better and the knot in her heart will slowly be untied." Shui Lan, where did flowers come from in the demon realm? His eyes darkened. Just as he was about to pinch this godly doctor to death, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. He paused, and after a while, a sincere smile appeared on his face. 3 days later, in the quiet room, warm sunlight shone in. Ning Xuema slowly opened her eyes and looked at the flickering sunlight in a daze. This was the scene that Shui Lan saw when he came in. The sunlight shone on her face, giving her a gentle layer of warmth. Some of the sunlight also reflected in her eyes, and she finally looked a little spirited. Her long eyelashes could be seen clearly under the sunlight, leaving a shadow under her eyes. She really needed to go out and bask in the sunlight. She looked pretty good under the sunlight. Shui Lan walked in front of Ning Xuema. His tall figure blocked some of the sunlight. With his back facing the light, he held her hand. "Momo, do you want to go out for a walk?" She had been basking in the sunlight for so long, and her fingers were still cold. Chapter 13:31. Moreover, without the effect of the sunlight, her face was still cold and emotionless. Ning Xuema quietly looked at him for a long time, so long that Shui Lan thought she was distracted again. She tilted her head and finally said, "No." When Shui Lan heard her voice, a warm current surged in his heart. She hadn't said a word for 2 months. Now that she finally opened her mouth, although it was only 2 words, it was a good start. Her voice was still a bit hoarse, no longer as clear and pleasant as before. She was also becoming more and more dispirited, not interested in anything. Every day, she would stay in her room either sleeping or daydreaming. Every day, Shui Lan lived in fear and trepidation. He was afraid that one day, she would fall asleep and never wake up again. "Momo, how did you become like this?" When she was Shui Emo, although she was indifferent, he could still see her smile often. When she was Ning Xuema, she was the one who laughed the most. She was always in high spirits, just like a proud little lion. But now, it was as if she had lost all her emotions, like a wooden doll that couldn't move or smile. He had to find the original her. Today, he must drag her out for a walk. Shuailan said again, "Momo, it's sunny outside. Don't you want to go out and see?" After a while, there was no response. Ning Xuema seemed to have fallen asleep again. Shuailan said a few more words to coax her to go out, but she didn't respond. She just stood there with her back facing Shuailan, lost in thought. Shuailan looked at Ning Xuema, who had given up on herself. He couldn't tell if he was angry or what. He suddenly bent down and picked her up. Looking at her, he smiled gently. "Momo, since you don't want to go, I'll carry you out." Ning Xuema, she looked at his slightly evil smile, and her body stiffened slightly. Then, she slowly relaxed, found a comfortable position in his arms, and closed her eyes. Shuailan, at the very least, it meant that Momo didn't reject his embrace. This could be considered a good thing among the bad, right? Shuailan tried to find joy in the midst of bitterness. Sighing, he carried her and walked outside. Along the way, Ning Xuema quietly nestled in his arms, as if she had fallen asleep. Wherever Shuailan passed by, countless fiendish demons knelt down. Just as they were about to shout, "Long live the Demon Emperor," he flicked his sleeve, and those fiendish demons shut their mouths. Momo needed to recuperate, they couldn't disturb her. After Shuailan walked past, countless demons looked at each other and saw their own eyes widened in amazement. Their demon king. When. He was so careful, as if he was hugging a fragile treasure, their curiosity was piqued. Every one of them wished they could become clairvoyants just to see who that woman was. Unfortunately, the Demon King hid her very well. Even with so many eyes, they still couldn't see what the woman in the Demon King's arms looked like, in the Demon Realm's garden. Indescribable flowers bloomed one after another, red, yellow, purple, hundreds of flowers were in full bloom, blooming fiercely and fiercely. A cool breeze blew past, as if it was a rain of petals. The sun was shining brightly, and the fragrance of flowers floated in the air. Shuailan lowered his head and said gently, "Momo, wake up. Look." Chapter 1332. Ning Xuema slowly opened her eyes and met Shuailan's affectionate gaze. She looked at him for a while, then looked away and looked at the flowers around her. They were really beautiful, very beautiful. The barren soil of the demon world was not suitable for flowers to grow. Demons, who were naturally cruel creatures, also did not cultivate the elegant hobby of appreciating flowers. Therefore, not a single flower had bloomed in the demon world for 10,000 years. It was also late autumn when hundreds of flowers withered. In order to make such a large sea of flowers, Shuailan must have put in a lot of effort. She quietly looked at the flowers in a daze, not knowing what she was thinking. A beautiful and bewitching flower suddenly appeared in front of her, followed by Shuailan's smile. "Momo. Look, these are your favorite flowers. I purposely plucked some from hell and brought them back." In fact, Shuailan's words were very implicit. How did he pick some? He pulled out all the red spider lilies on the side of the Bridge of Helplessness. As a result, the Bridge of Helplessness was still bare. He held a large pile of flowers and rushed back to the demon world. He planted them in his own garden and let people take good care of them. He nourished them with telekinesis, just so that Ning Xuema could appreciate them today. Ning Xuema stretched out her hand and took the bouquet of flowers in the palm of her hand to play with. The bright red spider lily slowly bloomed on her fingertips. The petals swayed, like a bright flame, quietly burning in her hand. The red petals made her hand seem even whiter, as if there was no blood in it. Ning Xuemo looked at the beautiful and bewitching flower, and her eyes flashed with an unknown light. The red spider lilies in her hand left the ground and slowly withered at a speed visible to the naked eye. A red light flashed. Shui Lan reflexively wanted to inject telekinesis into the flower, but Ning Xuemo blocked him. She looked at the gradually withered flower and said in a mocking tone, "Flowers from hell should live in hell." Shui Lan was stunned. Finally, he slowly tightened his arms and buried her in his arms. There was a trace of heartache in his voice. "Momo. I will accompany you in hell." Ning Xuemo slowly closed her eyes and remained silent. Shui Lan stood in the garden with her in his arms for a long time. It was so long that the sun was already hanging high in the sky, emitting a vigorous golden light. The two of them were both dressed in red, and standing in the colorful garden was indescribably pleasing to the eye. Ning Xuemo was breathing evenly in his arms. She seemed to have fallen asleep. He looked at Ning Xuemo's quiet sleeping face and his thin lips curved slightly, revealing a faint smile. "Momo, I'm willing to endure your hell." Now, the entire demonic world knew that the demonic king had someone he loved the most. He accompanied and cared for her, and even used his telekinesis to nourish a large garden just to win her smile. The garden. A large field of flowers. Most of the demons didn't know what flowers were. If they were asked if they liked flowers, they would ask, "What are flowers? Is it good?" It was inedible and tasteless. It was beautiful. The demons would be even more disdainful. "It's not delicious, and there's no demonic energy. What's the use of looking good?" That was why a demon's thinking was so simple and crude. It was just so boring. So Shui Lan's romantic way of planting a large garden for Ning Xuemo might be romantic enough to make them want to scream, but in the eyes of the demons, the demonic king seemed to be a bit improper. The people of the demonic world were very worried, and the ministers of the demonic world were also very worried. But a small group of people were very happy. Chapter 1333. However, a small group of people were very happy. They finally found a reason to rebel and establish themselves as kings, making the demon realm independent from the demon realm. Ever since the Great War of Immortals and Devils 3,000 years ago, only a small portion of the devil race was left. Shui Lan then brought that small portion of the devil race to the demon realm. Through the gradual evolution, demon and devil had gradually merged into one, evolving into demons and devils. These years, the demons grew stronger bit by bit, and some demons had the idea of independence. They wanted to establish themselves as kings. No, they wanted to become the demon king, the demon king. The power pyramid of the demon palace was formed by the demon king and the three protectors. Shui Lan had not returned to the demon palace for a long time, so one of the protectors in the demon palace began to have evil thoughts. He began to secretly gather troops, wanting to become the demon king himself. Bloodthirsty was an Earth rank level 9 great demon. In the demon realm, he was second only to Shui Lan. He had always wanted to overthrow Shui Lan, and now he finally found a good opportunity. However, he was not stupid. He would not start a rebellion right away. He wanted to build momentum first. Some rumors began to spread in the demon realm, such as, "The weather has been bad these days. It must be because of that vixen by the demon king's side. The war with the immortal realm failed again. It must be that vixen who brought bad luck. Why does the demon king favor her so much? Our demon realm has always respected strength. That vixen looks like she can be blown away by the wind. She needs protection wherever she goes. How can she be favored by the demon king? The demon king must have been blinded by her." There were countless rumors like this, and the more they spread, the worse it sounded. The momentum was enough, and the show began. In the demon palace, ministers began to talk about all kinds of bad things about Ning Xuemo. According to the signs of the heavens, she was a disaster. Their wise and mighty emperor could not have such a disaster by his side. She would endanger the demon realm and so on. Shui Lan's aura became stronger and colder. Looking at the three ministers kneeling below and listening to their fierce criticism of Ning Xuemo, he finally could not help but take action and suppress her. The demon palace was covered in blood. Everyone was silent out of fear, and the rumors seemed to have stopped. Late at night, Bloodthirsty Protector's mansion. Bloodthirsty stood in the courtyard, looking at the dark clouds covering the bright moon little by little. He gave a mysterious smile. The calm before the storm. Another day, the sky was clear, and sunlight filled the air. Shui Lan held Ning Xuemo in his arms as they walked through the sea of flowers. Behind them, there was a chubby boy who was about 3 or 4 years old. He was the servant boy that Shui Lan had given to Ning Xuemo. Shui Lan found that Ning Xuemo seemed to like children more in the past. She liked chubby and cute things. Therefore, he tried to bring the cutest and most adorable child in the entire devil world into the devil palace. He gave it a chubby name, Tang Yuan, and gave it to Ning Xuemo. Shui Lan observed for a few days. Ning Xuemo did not have much of a reaction when she saw Tang Yuan. She just sat there quietly and did not say anything. At first, Tang Yuan was still a little restrained in front of her, but later on, he chattered non-stop. Although Ning Xuemo never responded to him, she did not reject Tang Yuan's approach. Moreover, the gloominess between her brows seemed to dissipate a little. Therefore, Shui Lan allowed Tang Yuan to get closer and closer to Ning Xuemo. In the end, Tang Yuan got a small bed of his own in the quiet room. Sticking to Ning Xuemo. Shui Lan looked at Tang Yuan's small bed and gritted his teeth. Chapter 1334. Shui Lan looked at Tang Yuan's small bed and clenched his teeth. He had never stayed overnight in this quiet room before, but this white and fat dumpling actually managed to get a bed in just a few days. Now, Tang Yuan had become Ning Xuemo's little tail, following her wherever she went. Tang Yuan followed behind her, panting. His little face was a little red from exhaustion. He said in a childish voice, Your Majesty, walk slower. I can't keep up. Why would he follow a burden when he was strolling in the garden? Shui Lan wanted to shake Tang Yuan off and walk even faster. Tang Yuan tried his best to run forward with his 2 short legs, but he could not catch up no matter how hard he tried. In the end, he was tripped by a branch and fell to the ground. He was stunned. Shui Lan's figure was already far away. He suddenly burst into tears, his face full of grievance. Momo! Momo, Tang Yuan can't catch up to you. Don't you want Tang Yuan anymore? His cries traveled far and wide. Ning Xuemo's eyelashes trembled. She opened her eyes and looked at Shui Lan quietly. Shui Lan felt a little guilty under her gaze. His body stiffened and he stopped in his tracks. Tang Yuan saw that the red figure in front of him had stopped. He stopped crying and chased after her with a smile. Shui Lan looked at the white ball rolling behind him. The corner of his mouth twitched. The white ball rolled in front of him and sat down. Its apple-like face was covered in sweat. Suddenly, there was a faint smell of blood in the air. Shui Lan's eyes darkened. He gently put Ning Xuemo down. Momo, stay here for a while. I'll go take care of some things. I'll be back soon. He set up a protective barrier for Ning Xuemo and ordered the 8 experts to protect her in the dark. Only then did he turn into a red light and fly towards the demon palace. Ning Xuemo's injuries had almost recovered. She was now at Earth stage level 9. Within the demon palace, as long as she didn't want to, no one could hurt her. Actually, the people that Shui Lan had arranged for were not as experienced as Ning Xuema in terms of level and combat experience. However, Shui Lan was afraid that she would lose her will to live and not resist at all. That was why he set up a bunch of barriers and troops to protect her. Ning Xuema stood there calmly, looking at the rolling clouds in the distance. No one knew what she was thinking. The smell of blood was getting stronger. Ning Xuema frowned uncomfortably. In the distance, a small group of rebels was rushing over with a thick stench of blood. Their faces were ferocious, and it was obvious that they had gone berserk from the killing. When they saw Ning Xuema in the sea of flowers, their eyes lit up. With a whistle, the rebels from all walks of life began to gather in the garden. They wanted to take down Ning Xuema and force Shui Lan to submit. Ning Xuema stood in the layers of barriers. The several demon world experts who were protecting her were fighting with the rebels. Blood flowed like a river, and flesh and blood flew everywhere. The scene was extremely tragic. However, there were more and more rebels at the converging path. The 8 experts fell one by one. Tang Yuan was so scared that he hugged Ning Xuema's calf and trembled. Ning Xuema had seen such a scene many times in her previous life and this life, so she did not have much of a reaction. The 8 experts all fell. The rebels began to attack the barrier that Shui Lan had set up around her. Ning Xuema still stood there indifferently, without any intention of resisting. In fact, she did not want to live anymore. She was too tired in this life. If she could die here, it would be a form of relief. Perhaps she would return to her own world and bid farewell to this unlucky world. She would have no more interactions with the people in this world. Tang Yuan, who was hugging her calf, trembled even more. Chapter 1335. Tang Yuan, who was hugging her calf, trembled even more violently. However, when he realized that the rebel army had already broken through a layer of enchantment, he made up his mind and pushed Ning Xuema back. His young voice was filled with determination. Momo. Run quickly. I'll attract their attention. After saying that, he ran towards the rebel army, trying to attract their attention. Ning Xuema's gaze fell on Tang Yuan, who was trembling but facing the enemy's back. She sighed. No matter what, she had to save this child first. With a flick of her sleeve, Tang Yuan was sucked back. She held him in her arms and soared into the sky, flying into the distance. Tang Yuan was still in shock in her arms. Coincidentally, Shui Lan rushed back to the garden. When he saw that Ning Xuema was safe and sound and that she was still holding Tang Yuan in her arms, he finally relaxed. He waved his hand, and the countless demon army behind him took down the rebel army. Shui Lan looked at Ning Xuema carefully and heaved a sigh of relief. He asked, Momo, do you want to go with me to deal with these rebel army? Ning Xuema shook her head. No. Shui Lan sighed and picked her up. Then I'll send you back. He casually picked up Tang Yuan, who was jumping on the ground trying to pounce into Ning Xuema's arms. With a few leaps, he returned to the demon palace. He placed Ning Xuema on the bed and instructed Tang Yuan, take good care of her. Tang Yuan nodded his head. I will definitely take good care of Momo. Don't worry, Your Majesty. After Shui Lan left, Tang Yuan moved a small stool and sat in front of Ning Xuema. He began to chatter again. Ning Xuema looked at Tang Yuan and her eyes finally softened. Tang Yuan was thirsty after talking for a long time. He poured himself a glass of water and gulped it down. Then, he looked at Ning Xuema in a daze. Ning Xuema averted her gaze and looked out of the window. Tang Yuan also looked out of the window. His big eyes lit up and he hugged Ning Xuemo's calf. Momo, let's go watch the show too. Let's see how His Majesty punishes those bad guys. Ning Xuemo subconsciously refused, but she could not stand Tang Yuan's pleas. She sighed and finally stood up, taking the initiative to walk out of the room. Inside the meeting hall, Shui Lan sat high above. Looking down at the kneeling officials, his expression was difficult to discern. All the remaining rebels had their acupoints sealed and were thrown to the ground. Bloodthirsty received the best treatment. He was tied up tightly like a rice dumpling. At the same time, all of his acupoints were sealed, rendering him completely immobile. Bloodthirsty didn't know why Shui Lan had brought them to the meeting hall. Shouldn't he kill them directly? Soon, he got the answer. Shui Lan played with a jade talisman and said casually, Demon Emperor Shui Lan is obsessed with women and doesn't care about the overall situation of the demon world. We should overthrow the old emperor and establish a new one. Is this your reason? Bloodthirsty and the other demons' faces turned pale, but now that things had come to this, it was better to say it straightforwardly. Therefore, Bloodthirsty stared at Shui Lan and said viciously, That's right. You're no longer worthy of being our demon emperor. After Bloodthirsty finished speaking, he waited for Shui Lan's fatal blow, but after waiting for a long time, nothing happened. Shui Lan smiled instead. His smile was indescribably gentle and elegant, like an elegant scholar. It was impossible to associate him with the cruel and bloodthirsty demon emperor. Shui Lan said lazily, You're right. I'm indeed not suitable to continue being the demon emperor. Bloodthirsty's eyes widened and he choked, not knowing how to react. Chapter 1336. The demon ministers were shocked at first, then they suddenly knelt down. Your Majesty. Please be careful with your words. Shui Lan looked at the demon ministers kneeling down and revealed a cynical smile. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly looked at the door, then slowly stood up and walked down step by step. Bloodthirsty looked at Shui Lan walking towards him with an unfathomable smile. His body stiffened and his face turned pale. Was Shui Lan finally going to deal with him? What kind of torture would it be? He couldn't help but quickly go through the torture of the demon world in his mind, and his body trembled slightly. He was getting closer, even closer. The closer he got, the stronger the pressure on Shui Lan. Bloodthirsty felt Shui Lan's oppressive aura getting closer and closer. His face turned pale, and his heart beat wildly. He closed his eyes and waited for the torture to come. The oppressive aura was getting stronger and stronger. In the end, Shui Lan walked past him without even looking at him and walked towards the door. Bloodthirsty, the demons, Bloodthirsty turned around fiercely, wanting to see what Shui Lan was going to do. When he turned around, he was first dazzled by the sunlight outside. Then, a peerless beauty in a bright red dress slowly walked out of the halo. Words could no longer describe her beauty. Her eyebrows were exquisite, and her skin was like jade. However, there was a touch of indifference on her face, as if nothing could affect her. It was Ning Xuemo. She was the vase girl that caused the emperor to miss the morning assembly. Shui Lan held Ning Xuemo's hand and smiled. Momo, why are you here? Ning Xuemo lowered her head and glanced at Tang Yuan. This little guy who had never seen the world rolled his eyes. He suddenly saw so many important people, and his little face turned red with excitement. He desperately tugged at the corner of Ning Xuemo's skirt, looking eager to go in. Ning Xuemo glanced at the scene in the hall and said indifferently, Tang Yuan wants to come and take a look. Shui Lan looked down at the pink and white doll. For the first time, he felt that this little fellow wasn't too much of an eyesore. Shui Lan held Ning Xuemo's hand and walked into the hall. Momo, come. Ning Xuemo let her hold her hand and slowly walked towards the main hall. Both of them were dressed in red. One of them was elegant and affectionate, while the other had an exquisite and indifferent appearance. When they stood together, they were an indescribable match. Before anyone could react, Shui Lan had already placed Ning Xuemo in his previous seat. Looking at the dumbstruck expressions of the demon race below, he curled his lips and revealed a meaningful smile. This seat is most suitable for her. After saying that, he casually bowed to Ning Xuemo. Is that so? My Lord Demon Emperor. Ning Xuemo was speechless. She glanced at Shui Lan and didn't say anything. The demon race's ministers reacted as if they had been thrown into boiling water. For a moment, they were all agitated and furious. Another loyal minister suddenly stood up and knelt down heavily. Lord Demon Emperor, please reconsider. Shui Lan raised his eyebrows. No one can stop what I have decided. She's just a pretty vase. How can she be worthy of being our Demon Emperor? Your Majesty, I don't agree. Your Majesty, please don't be blinded by beauty. Do something that will shock the world. She only has a beautiful shell, but she's sick and needs people to protect her wherever she goes. How can such a good-for-nothing be worthy of being our Demon Emperor? Ridiculous. Too ridiculous. Your Majesty, please reconsider. Below, another group of people knelt down. Everyone's faces were filled with disbelief.